Incidentally, the swearing-in scene of President Johnson, which becomes a historical scene in the long history of the United States, was very impressive, and we all await for immediate information and for the history books the scene. But it was a woman district judge who, in tears, gave him the oath of office, presumably on a Bible, because he would not affirm, he would swear on a Bible. It was in the forward compartment of a presidential plane just before the takeoff to Washington. And Mrs. Johnson was president, and I believe Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, although we have not had the word. As we told you before, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate is a particularly important man in our governmental institutions because the Senate must confirm ambassadors and confirm treaties signed and has a special duty in connection with our foreign relations, our international affairs. We take you now for a statement by Chairman Senator William Fulbright, Foreign Relations, Senate of the United States, in Washington.
Of President Kennedy is a tragedy beyond words for his family, for his country, and for the world. It is an unspeakable crime. I extend my heartfelt sympathy to his family. They have lost a loved one. I have lost a friend. The American people have lost a president who has led the country with wisdom, with honor, and with dedication. In the face of so sudden a tragedy, we should be thankful we have tested institutions of government which will continue to function in an orderly manner. We are also fortunate that President Johnson is a man of long and broad experience in government. Confronted with this tragic emergency, all Americans should unite behind our new president and demonstrate the strength of our democracy to ourselves and to the world.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, for another possibly slight lifting of the curtain on the mystery surrounding the assassination of the president, we switch now once again to Dallas, Texas, to WFAA. Tom Perryman, will you come in?
Yes, we will, Morgan. Governor Connelly was shot 3 times. A bullet entered his right arm, his left leg, and the back. He's reported in very, very serious condition, but not critical condition. Also, we have 2 of our newsmen at the mic right now. Both were there when the president was shot. I would like for you to hear the comments of Mel Couch and Pierce Allman. Mal, could you tell us what you saw?
Yes, I was in the 8th car in the motorcade. There were 5 other newsmen, myself, in this car. We just rounded a corner, and the president's car was heading out of downtown proper. We were at right angles to the president's car, about approximately 50 to 75 feet away. I heard this shot, or what it sounded like at the moment, to be a motorcycle backfiring, and I heard another one, and by the 3rd shot, it sounded, by then, the men in the car realized that it was not a motorcycle, but it was someone firing. Our car rounded the corner just as the president's car sped off down underneath an underpass and out onto what is known as Stemmons Expressway. I looked to the left of me as a policeman fell, pulled his pistol. To the right of me, 2 citizens dropped to the ground, and I had a chance to take a quick shot of the window from whence the assassin fired his weapon.
That was an eyewitness report from Mal Couch, WFAA TV newsman. Pierce Allman also was nearby when the president was shot. Can you add anything briefly, Pierce?
Not at all, Tom. I heard the 3 shots. I glanced. The president was down in the car. I thought he was ducking, which was a natural reaction. And Jackie was just beginning to clutch at him, and he had Jackie. Then the car sped off, and I ran over to the Texas School Book Depository building where the shots occurred. And I didn't see anybody run out or run past. We just got back from there.
Also, Morgan, we have a statement from Lieutenant Governor Preston Smith in Austin, and Roger Reddy has, I believe, talked with the Lieutenant Governor. What is the story on that, Roger?
Yes, Tom. From Austin, Lieutenant Governor Preston Smith said that he was shocked and that this was, of course, a terrible day for both Texas and the nation, referring to Governor Connelly's wound and to whether or not the situation in Austin was going to be changed. The governor's office said that doctors, of course, as we told you earlier, have opened up the chest. But Lieutenant Governor Preston Smith said that he would not be able to do anything official as regards the office of governor of the state of Texas until he hears from Governor Connelly himself or from an aide in the area.
That's the story from here, Morgan.
Thank you. I would like to note at this time we have word from the White House Secret Service detail about the confusion surrounding those who died along with the president. The White House Secret Service detail denies that any Secret Service man was killed in the Dallas assassination. Now, that's the report that's been bothering us from the beginning of this report to you on the assassination of President Kennedy, because we did know and had confirmation that a Dallas policeman had been shot. And, of course, the man apparently connected with that has been arrested in a theater. At least the man by the name of Oswald, a young man, black curly hair, has said it's all over now. But anyway, the Dallas policeman has been shot. There has been no Secret Service man shot. Incidentally, the Secret Service detail in the White House announces that Speaker John McCormick of the House of Representatives has now received a Secret Service guard. He is next in line for the presidency behind Lyndon Baines Johnson, who has been sworn in as President of the United States and is now en route to Washington. From London, we have the first reference to recent struggles in the United States over civil rights. British Labour Party leader Harold Wilson told a public meeting where he was speaking that President Kennedy's, quote, struggle for racial equality in the United States is something that will in memory long outlive his life. Mr. Wilson expressed deep horror at this evil act of assassination. I pay tribute, he went on, to one who has been a good friend of this country, Great Britain, a great world statesman, and a great fighter for peace. Assassins seem never to recognize that they often martyrize those who are their targets. And now, we have reaction from all over the United States now pouring in on us. Americans in tears on some occasions. In the streets of New York, there were people crying today. Let's get a closer look at reaction. But first, Joseph Michaels has the statement from Governor Nelson Rockefeller that we read to you. I'd like to switch now for the statement in the governor's own voice.
This is a shocking and terrible tragedy for the nation and the world. Mrs. Rockefeller and I join with all New Yorkers and every American in extending heartfelt sympathy to Mrs. Kennedy and the President's family. May God grant strength and guidance to Lyndon Johnson as he assumes his grave responsibilities under these tragic circumstances. The prayers of all of us will be with him. I have proclaimed for the state of New York a 30-day period of mourning, and I have directed that all state offices shall be closed on the day of the President's funeral.
Morgan, the governor made this statement in New York. He maintains an office here, and he happened to be in New York for a meeting today. He came into the room looking gray-faced, solemn, and emotionally very strongly affected. He made this statement, and quite obviously he had no desire today to ask and answer any questions about anything. He's now left, and that is all there is to it.
I have no doubt, Joseph, that he is speaking the voice of the people of the state of New York as well as of the city of New York. As I have reported just before you joined our broadcast on this occasion, there are people crying in the streets of New York today. I wondered if you would give us another reaction from the people themselves on this occasion.
Well, I have been spending this afternoon, since this thing, going around New York, talking to different people. I was in Lower New York at the Stock Exchange. The reaction is one of disbelief at first, invariably. The people look at you and they say, well, he can't be dead. And then when you say, yes, the president is dead, people just turn away sometimes. They sometimes go through the kind of mechanical motions that all of us do under stress. That is, trying to do the things that we ordinarily do. Nobody can find words to express themselves, nor can I. The situation in New York is one of things at a standstill. The people stand around, and very little work is being done. Even when they drive off, they seem to pull over to the side of the road to try and find out if something else is happening. And the churches of our city are tremendously crowded. St. Patrick's Cathedral, I just passed on the way to the governor's office, is full of people coming in and going out. All of the doors of this great house of worship are open, and people of the president's fellow faith are worshiping there. In synagogues and in other churches all through the city, the attendance is just fantastic, of people who do not want to do anything except commune with their God.
Thank you, Joe.
All right.
As a matter of fact, you used a phrase there, the New York City is at a standstill. Perhaps at this time it might be interesting to recall exactly how things came to a standstill, because the stock exchange itself came to a sudden halt today, and that story itself is dramatic. The news about President Kennedy brought an early closing. Many Wall Streeters were at lunch when word came that the president had been wounded, perhaps fatally. The bulletin reached the financial district at 1:39 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Very soon the stock market was moving lower. At 1:30 p.m., 9 minutes before the flash, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was up 3 1/3 points. Shortly after 2 p.m., this closely watched average was down 2.5 points. The Dow Jones Industrial Average closed with a loss of more than 21. At 2:07 p.m., the Board of Governors of the New York Stock Exchange announced that trading had been closed because of a flood of orders. About half an hour after this, the flash came that President Kennedy was dead. Trading at the time the exchange was closed was running 20 minutes behind floor transactions. The move of the Board of Governors closing the exchange marked the first time there had been a closing in mid-session since the 3rd of August, 1933. The reason then was that gas fumes had leaked out onto the floor of the exchange. Since then, it had remained open through the natural deaths of presidents, Franklin D. Roosevelt, through a world war, through the Korean War, the assassination attempt against President Truman, and the heart attack suffered by President Eisenhower. Through all of these, it had remained open. The exchange publicist said that all market orders for any type that remained unexecuted when trading was stopped had expired. They will not be executed. The last quote came across the tickers 49 minutes after the market closed. Immediately following word that trading had been stopped on the big board, the American Exchange also suspended trading. The Midwest Exchange in Chicago, third largest in the nation, also halted operations, as did the Pacific Stock Exchange. The Cotton and Wool Exchanges stopped trading. So did the cocoa and sugar and other exchanges. The last prices on many of the favorite blue-chip stocks showed them down from $1 to $10. Examples: American Telephone down 7, Chrysler down 4 3/4, United Aircraft down 5 1/4, Allied Chemical down 4 3/8, U.S. Rubber, International Paper each down 3 1/4. The losses were sharp all through the list before the exchange was closed. If it hadn't been for the very fast action of the Board of Governors in suspending the trading, there could have been chaos. And at that moment, you might say, historically, almost all business came to a standstill in the city of New York, the financial capital of the world. And now for more reaction from abroad. We switch about 4,000 miles across the Atlantic, partway across the Mediterranean, for a conversation with Irving R. Levine in Rome.
Hello, Morgan.
Hello, Irving. What time is it?
Morgan, it's 10 minutes to 11 in the night.
What kind of reports do you have for us?
Well, Morgan, here, a crowd of several hundred American tourists are gathered in front of the United States Embassy, drawn there by mutual grief. They are simply standing, reading the English-language Rome-American newspaper, a special edition. They're talking among themselves, some crying, watching cars from other embassies arriving with expressions of sympathy. I have a message here, a statement by Francis Cardinal Spellman of New York, with whom I spoke a short while ago. The Cardinal said, "I was terribly shocked and grief-stricken at the dreadful news of the President's death. I have never seen a more universal demonstration of sorrow from people in my lifetime. Bishops from all over the world here in Rome for the Ecumenical Council have been calling me." Cardinal Spellman continued by saying, "It's a loss not only to his wonderful family, but to our country, and a loss to the world. He lived only a short time, but he accomplished tremendous things. He was a brave and courageous man."
That is the reaction there. I notice we have papal reaction here on the death of the president. Do you have any further reports on that?
Yes, Morgan, we have someone at the Vatican right now who in a moment or two will be telephoning us the text of the Pope's statement, a message to the American people, to the United States. Several other items. Premier designate Aldo Moro has suspended his negotiations for formation of a new Italian government out of sorrow. Various political leaders, including the communists, have expressed their grief at this. President Segni will attend a special church rite tomorrow to mourn the president's passing.
An index of the passing of the President of the United States in this very shocking manner. There are other indices of this. Incidentally, the Harvard-Yale football game scheduled for tomorrow will not be played because of the president's death. That was announced by a spokesman for Harvard. There's no decision immediately whether the game will be played a week from then or not. It gives an indication of the extent of the mourning and the depth of the shock. The assassination of President John Kennedy in Dallas, Texas at 12:30 p.m. Central Time today. Incidentally, 6 members of the President's cabinet were out of the country flying to Japan. They had been in Hawaii. An hour and a half out of Honolulu, on their way to Japan, the secretaries were advised of the assassination, and immediately they ordered the plane turned back. They were expected to move into Honolulu for refueling and a speed back to Washington. In the party were Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Commerce Luther Hodges, Secretary of Labor W. Willard Wirtz, Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall, and Secretary of Agriculture Orville Freeman. And their wives were with them. Secretary of the Treasury Douglas Dillon was the 6th cabinet member. Others aboard were Walter Heller, the chairman of the President's Council on Economic Advisors, and Mrs. Heller, and White House Press Secretary Pierre Salinger, and Robert Manning, Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs. The meeting in Tokyo would have brought together the cabinet secretaries of the 2 countries for a meeting on trade and economic affairs. It was scheduled to open Monday and to run for 3 days. It would have been a most auspicious meeting because the liberal and pro-American government of Japan has just been confirmed in office by an election. For the historical record, perhaps it would be fitting at this time, although unpleasant, to relate to you the details concerning the death of the President of the United States. The story that will go into the history books. He was administered the last rites of the Roman Catholic Church shortly after he was carried into the Parkland Hospital in Dallas. Emergency treatment was given to the dying president. It was described to newsmen by 2 physicians, Drs. Kemp Clark and Malcolm Perry. Dr. Perry said Kennedy suffered a neck wound, a bullet wound in the lower part of the neck. There was a second wound in Kennedy's head, but Perry was not certain whether it was inflicted by the same bullet. The physician said the president lost consciousness as soon as he was hit and never revived. "We never had any hope of saving his life," said Dr. Perry, though 8 or 10 physicians attended him in a frantic but futile effort to keep him alive. Dr. Clark, a brain surgeon, reported that the president was given oxygen, blood transfusions, then was administered an anesthetic so an emergency tracheotomy could be performed. That was to help his breathing. During this procedure, surgeons cut a hole in the president's windpipe in an attempt to ease his breathing. Dr. Perry said that shortly after he reached the hospital, the chief executive's heart action failed. There was no palpable pulse beat. The time of death was announced officially, as we reported to you before, 1 p.m., Central Standard Time, Parkland Hospital, Dallas, Texas. And now, we have further details on plans for the arrival of the president's body in Washington. As we've noted to you before now, arrival is expected about 6:05 p.m. aboard a presidential plane, and a party, including President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who has taken the oath of office, and Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy are also flying. They are due at 5:25 p.m. So now let's recheck on these plans for further details. To Robert Goralski at White House with the arrival plans. Goralski, would you
The
come?
body of the late president will be taken directly to Bethesda Naval Hospital north of Washington as soon as Air Force One, the presidential jet, lands at Andrews Air Force Base. Aboard Air Force One, in addition to the body of former President Kennedy, is the new President Lyndon Johnson. Making funeral arrangements for the late president is Sergeant Shriver, the director of the Peace Corps, and the president's brother-in-law. As of this moment, the children of President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy, John Jr. and Caroline, have not been told of Mr. Kennedy's death. They are in the executive mansion with their nurse, Maud Shaw. Mrs. Kennedy is believed to be aboard Air Force One, the presidential aircraft now flying from Dallas to Andrews Air Force Base in nearby Maryland. When Air Force One does land at Andrews, members of the cabinet who are in Washington or under secretaries of other agencies will be at Andrews to welcome President Lyndon Johnson. Robert Goralski, NBC News at the White House.
And from the other end, in Pennsylvania Avenue, on Capitol Hill, an official announcement by the Speaker of the House of Representatives, John W. McCormick, who becomes first in line of succession for the presidency of the United States under President Johnson. Mr. McCormick has just announced that President Kennedy's body will lie in state at the White House tomorrow. Apparently, it has been planned, instead of going immediately to the rotunda of the Capitol with the body of the president, first he will lie in state at the White House, as was done in the case of President Roosevelt. And then the body will be taken to the rotunda of the Capitol, where the national mourning will begin. We had been planning to go back to Bonn, Germany, for another report on reaction at the point of contact between East and West. But now we find we can go even closer to the point of contact between the two ideologies in today's world. We take you now to John Chancellor, NBC News in Berlin.
The people of West Berlin mourned the president as one of their own tonight. After the first shock, many people began weeping openly over the death of a man who visited here 5 months ago and said, "Ich bin ein Berliner. I am a Berliner." The news of the president's death swept across Berlin. The telephone exchange reported that it was swamped with calls and some of the equipment wouldn't work. As the news spread, people walked out into the streets on a cold and rainy night, asking one another if it was really true. In the restaurants along the Kurfürstendamm, the main street in West Berlin, customers gathered around radio and television sets. Most people watched for a while and then left their meals unfinished and just went home. At least one of the legitimate theaters in West Berlin stopped its performance in the middle, announced the tragic news, and canceled the evening's performance. A dance festival was stopped in a similar way. And a show at the West Berlin Sports Palace was halted by the news. Mayor Willy Brandt of West Berlin asked the people of the city to put candles in their windows tomorrow night in memory of the American president who had so eloquently, and only a few months ago, pledged his affection and allegiance to this city. Mayor Brandt, who is expected to go to the United States for the funeral, said tonight that with the first citizen of the free world, Berlin has lost its best friend. Students from Berlin's Free University tonight will stage a midnight memorial march through the center of West Berlin. They will march on some of the streets traveled by the president when he visited this encircled city in June. The student march will end at the Schöneberg Rathaus, the city hall where Mr. Kennedy made his famous "I am a Berliner" speech. Tonight, on a cold and rainy night, other West Berliners mourn him. There have been reports in Berlin that the West Berlin police are on the alert for any demonstrations that might take place near the Berlin Wall. The police refuse to confirm this report. So far, there have been no demonstrations of any size around the wall, and the weather being what it is, cold and rainy, there probably will be none at the wall tonight. However, an hour and 5 minutes from now, the students of the Free University will march, and a slight tension comes to Berlin whenever large groups of people gather in either sector of the city. There has been, as far as can be told from West Berlin, no direct reaction yet from East Berlin to the news of the president's death. However, that is an understandable reaction. They are very slow to react in the East, and so far we have nothing, and that is standard.
Thank you, John Chancellor. We now have the sad duty to report that the possibility arises that the death of President Kennedy is connected with the Cold War, and fairly definitely. The police department of Dallas, Texas, reports that Lee H. Oswald, who was arrested in a theater in the outskirts of that city soon after the assassination of President Kennedy, is the prime suspect in the assassination of the president. They identify Lee H. Oswald, this curly black-haired man in his 20s, as a chairman of a Fair Play for Cuba committee. Now, in that connection, it is interesting to note what the Fair Play for Cuba committee is in the United States, or the various committees that were formed in universities primarily a couple of years ago. I happen to have reported the Fair Play for Cuba committee formation. This committee was originally formed with $5,000 traced directly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation from the hands of the foreign minister of Cuba, Raul, to an American, and it was intended to build a backfire against the government of the United States here. Now, this does not indict all Fair Play for Cuba committees, but the fact is that Fidel Castro was the father of the Fair Play for Cuba committee idea in the United States, and the proof is complete and absolute from beginning to end. So we repeat the bulletin just received from Dallas, Texas. Lee H. Oswald, a young man in his 20s, black curly hair, was arrested in the theater in Dallas as the prime suspect in the assassination of President Kennedy. He scuffled with the police. He wounded one of the police. And when he was finally subdued after a pistol was taken away from him, he said, well, it's all over now. So all of the evidence points to the fact that the police of Dallas are on the track of a very tragic connection involving the death of the President of the United States. There was a slight further detail on that point. Oswald worked in the building from which the shots were fired at the president. His supervisor said he was there at noon. That was a warehouse about 8 stories high. The shot was fired from a 5th or a 6th-story window that has not been definitely determined yet. And there were workmen in the building refurbishing it for some reason or another. There were no tenants at the time in the building. So Oswald was a worker in this building, and he had been there at noon, was seen there by his supervisor at that time. The man's name is Lee H. Oswald. He's been identified as a chairman of a Fair Play for Cuba committee, and the Fair Play for Cuba committee was formed with money, dollars, supplied directly by Fidel Castro through his foreign minister, who was then in the United Nations about 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. And we now have what at least is an indirect connection with the situation. As we've reported to you, maybe we have more detail on this now. Let's take a try for it. We switch once again to Dallas, Texas, WAFAA.
Thank you,
Tom Parrigan.
Morgan. A man has been arrested, Lee Oswald, a 24-year-old man who said 2 years ago he wanted Russian citizenship, is being questioned to see whether he had any connection with the assassination of President Kennedy. Under questioning now by police, reliable sources indicate he's the man, according to the questions that have been asked and the way he has answered them. The rifle that was used to kill the president has been picked up by police. Ballistics tests are being undertaken at this time. Oswald was an Oak Cliff, Dallas man, Oak Cliff, a section of Dallas, and he's undergoing questioning now, and sources that we have talked to indicate that he is the man. That's the latest story from here, Morgan.
Thank you very much, Tom. Right alert and on the job. Just as we get the official bulletin from the Police Department of Dallas, we have confirmation that this man had asked for Russian citizenship. I believe you said as recently as 2 years ago. We have a statement now from Ambassador Adlai Stevenson of the United Nations. Stevenson, as you may remember, in the convention in 1960, was the man who made the most direct assault on the candidacy of a rival, and that rival was John Kennedy. Ambassador Stevenson later turned to serve the administration he had tried to prevent from taking office, but, of course, well within party politics. The ambassador made this statement this afternoon. The tragedy of this day is beyond instant comprehension. All of us who knew him will bear the grief of his death to the day of our death. And all men everywhere who love peace and justice and freedom will bow their heads. At such a moment, we can only turn to prayer. Prayer to comfort our grief, to sustain Mrs. Kennedy and Mr. Kennedy's family, to strengthen President Johnson, and to guide us in time to come. Apparently, we now can clear up a point about the party, the White House party, traveling from Dallas, Texas, where the president died at 1 p.m. Central Time, to Washington, D.C., where the body will be lying in state temporarily in the White House. The word is, apparently, that the entire party, President Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, and Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, are on the same Air Force plane. It will arrive in Andrews Field Air Force Base areas about 6:05 p.m., and will be driven, and all of the party will be driven immediately to the White House and is expected to arrive there at 6:30. President Johnson will leave the White House jet and take a helicopter to the White House. President Kennedy's body will be taken to the Bethesda Naval Hospital, method of transport not now known. Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy is believed to be aboard the plane as well. A report from Dallas indicates that she is. The Kennedy children have not, and we repeat this, the Kennedy children have not been notified of their father's death. They're in the White House with Miss Maud Shaw. Miss Maud Shaw is their nurse. Sergeant Shriver, the late president's brother-in-law, is with them. And from other reports we have had from the White House, it does appear that the sad duty of notifying Caroline, who observes her 6th birthday next Wednesday, and her brother John, who observes his 3rd birthday on Monday, the sad duty of notifying them of the death of their father is being left to Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, who will arrive in the White House in about an hour and a half from now. And now we have more detail on the arrest of the prime suspect in the assassination of President John Kennedy. We return to a conversation with Tom Perriman, station WFAA in Dallas, Texas. Will you come in, Tom?
Morgan, federal officers have been going over the man very closely for a considerable period of time now. The witnesses to the president's assassination are in the next room at police headquarters, but they have not yet looked at the man. As we told you, the rifle used for the president's assassination has been recovered and is undergoing fingerprint analysis at this time. Now, the report to us is now that Oswald was picked up in New Orleans not long ago and fined $10 for distributing communist literature. That's the latest story on Oswald. He has not been charged yet, but is undergoing rigid interrogation at Dallas Police Headquarters.
Well, it is significant that the police and the federal authorities are taking their time. They're giving us identifications of this man as at least a fellow traveler, probably a communist. He is identified by the police as a chairman of a Fair Play for Cuba committee, a group formed directly by money furnished by Fidel Castro through his foreign ministry, and now we learn additional detail of a communist-type background. Some time ago, we reported that Pope Paul was indicting a statement concerning the death of President Kennedy. It is significant that the Pope is personally writing this statement. He's taken a great deal of time before finishing it. He wishes to say something, apparently, directly to the American people. We take you again to Irving R. Levine in Rome.
Pope Paul VI has just sent this message to the American people. We are profoundly stricken by the tragic and sad news of the assassination of the President of the United States of America, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and of the grave wounding of Governor Connelly. We are profoundly saddened by such a shocking crime, by the mourning which strikes through its leader, a great and civilized country, by the sorrow which afflicts Mrs. Kennedy, her children, and all her relatives. Pope Paul's message continued. We deplore with all our heart this event. We express the hope that the death of this great statesman will not bring damage to the American people, but will reinforce their moral and civil sense and strengthen their sentiments of nobility and of peace. And we pray to God that the sacrifice of John Kennedy will aid the cause promoted by him for the defense of the liberty of peoples and of peace in the world. The Pope's message goes on. He was the first Catholic president of the United States. We remember to have had the honor of his visit and to have found in him great wisdom and high ideals for the welfare of humanity. Tomorrow we will offer a holy mass for the peace of his soul, for the comfort of those who mourn his death, and so that not hatred but love will reign among the human race. That's the message to the American people from Pope Paul VI.
A most impressive message, and a footnote, that Pope Paul composed his own personal statement concerning the death of President Kennedy. And now we have an extended report on a former president's statement about the death of the chief executive of our nation. We read you before, briefly, the first statement issued by former President Dwight Eisenhower, who stressed in his original statement our nationhood and the presidency itself. And now we have an opportunity for an extended statement from President Eisenhower.
I share the sense of shock and dismay that the entire nation must feel at the despicable act that took the life of the nation's president. On the personal side, Mrs. Eisenhower and I share the grief that Mrs. Kennedy must now feel, and we send to her our prayerful thoughts and sympathetic sentiments in this hour.
General, how would you counsel the American people at this time?
In the face of such a terrible thing, I'm sure the entire citizenry of the nation will join as one man in expressing not only their grief but their indignation at this act, and will stand faithfully behind the government.
General, could you tell us how you got the word?
I was at a meeting for the United Nations, and while there, a member of the meeting was called out and came back and told us the news. Although at that time, we did not know the president was dead. We did not know when I got back here at that time that he was dead. But, matter of fact, we had the last message we had was one rather of hope. And the entire company merely paused for a minute at the request of the chairman, and each of us, in his own way, said a silent prayer for the president.
Should there be any concern, sir, over national security at a time like this?
No, I think the whole nation now would be almost all of us security agents.
Will the nation be all right in a few months ahead?
Oh, I'm not going to predict anything of that. I just say this. The American nation is a people of great common sense, and they are not going to be stampeded or bewildered.
Thank you, Mr. President. History have assassinations affected the political course of events?
Well, of course, in Lincoln's assassination, the presidency went to a man who was a registered Democrat, Mr. Johnson. In Garfield, I doubt that there was any. And, of course, McKinley, that brought in Theodore Roosevelt. Of course, there have been other attempts in late years. Mr. Truman was at a grave threat to his life, and Mr. Roosevelt, just before he was inaugurated, you remember, down when Mayor Cermak was killed, ran a very grave risk. These things have happened, and it seems inexplicable to me, because Americans are loyal, and it's just this occasional psychopathic sort of accident that occurs, and I don't know what we can do about it.
Could you say anything, General, about how people will feel abroad from all your experience with the United Nations and others? How will it be taken abroad?
Well, I think they will be a bit bewildered. This, in the civilized countries of the world, this doesn't happen so often. And you remember in the starting of World War I, the murder of the Archduke Ferdinand, I think his name was. Well, this itself almost, is one of the contributory causes to that war. And but here, I just don't know what happens. But we are a nation that where our freedoms are allowed or are observed in such a way that everybody is ready you might say, capable, if he's ready to put his own life on the line.
General, how will you spend the rest of today and tomorrow? How will you spend the rest of today and tomorrow?
Look, I have canceled the dinner date that I had for tonight. Tomorrow, I'm going immediately to my home, and if I'm wanted for any purpose whatsoever, I will, of course, be available.
Would you have any advice for the American people at this time, General?
No, as I said, I know the American people will stand solid, and they will not be stampeded.
Thank you, Mr. President.
All right. Thank you. Good night, fellows.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have further reports on the cabinet officers, the 6 officers of the government who were away when President Kennedy was assassinated. Bill Roddy, NBC News San Francisco, reports that Secretary of State Dean Rusk and a party of 5 other cabinet officers have left Honolulu for the nonstop flight to Washington. As you may remember, they were on their way to Tokyo from Honolulu when they got the word aboard their plane, and they ordered it to return to Honolulu. They have now refueled, and they're on their way nonstop all the way to Washington, apparently with no stop on the way, such as San Francisco. Their military jet is expected to land at Andrews Air Force Base at 12:29 a.m. on Saturday morning. An Air Force official in Honolulu told Roddy by telephone a few minutes ago that the sequence of events that brought the cabinet officers back to Hawaii was about like this. They left for Tokyo as scheduled at 7:03 Honolulu time. This morning at 8:37 they received word that the president had been wounded in a bulletin from a press association. They had no further confirmation. They continued their journey. At 9 a.m. it was decided to return to Honolulu. At 9:33 they received word that the president had died. And Secretary of State Rusk got the plain public address system going to announce the sad news to the other cabinet officials. Mr. Rusk, along with Secretary Dillon of the Treasury, Douglas Dillon, and Udall, and Freeman, and Hodges, and Wirtz, issued the following statement. We are deeply shocked by this grievous tragedy which has removed a great and beloved leader of our country and of the world quest for peace. Our hearts are with Mrs. Kennedy and her family at this time of sorrow, and we renew our dedication. Our prayers go with President Johnson as he assumes the high responsibility of the presidency. And now for the rest of the story of reaction in Vatican City. We return to Irving R. Levine in Rome.
A book of condolences has been opened at the American Embassy here in Rome. Although it is now almost 11:30 at night, about 150 people are lined up at the embassy to sign and thereby to indicate their sympathy with the Kennedy family and the American government. The Church of Santa Susana, the American Catholic Church in Rome, has announced that tomorrow afternoon, Francis Cardinal Spellman of New York will celebrate Requiem Mass in honor of the President. Flags will fly at half-mast here in Italy for 3 days. This has just been ordered by Italian President Antonio Segni. And at 5 minutes past midnight, Rome time, in about 3/4 of an hour from now, the Italians will have an opportunity to see something of this American tragedy via a satellite feed of film from the United States. This is Irving R. Levine, NBC News, Rome.
The connection of the president's assassination, at least its potential connection with the Cold War, is being stressed in various parts of the world. As we have heard from Bonn, Germany, the number one alert is up for the military services of that country. That's next to the alert for war because they're in close contact with the eastern satellite nations, and they do not expect any trouble, but this kind of alert is normal in this kind of situation. And now we have word from Laredo, Texas, a bulletin. The Mexican government officially announces through its Laredo offices that it has sealed the Texas-Mexican border for 72 hours against the passage of any person who may wish to pass. That might be an indication that it is generally suspected that the plot extends beyond the young man Oswald who was arrested in Dallas and who has now been connected with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in the United States and who is reported to have asked or have boasted that he would like to be a citizen of Russia. This young man is being intensively questioned in the Dallas police headquarters at this time. The witnesses to the assassination who could possibly identify him have not seen him yet. His fingerprint record is being checked out. The police, all federal authorities, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Secret Service, are all moving extremely carefully to be sure that they're making no mistake in their haste to solve the assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas, Texas at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time today. And now we would like to give you more detail on the Kennedy children. As we've told you before, Caroline and John, Caroline 6, John 3, were at the White House when their father was killed. Sergeant Shriver, brother-in-law of the president, husband of Eunice Shriver, the president's sister, and Eunice went to the White House immediately. They saw that the children were in the good care of Maud Shaw, an old family friend, and then they immediately went to Hyannisport or Boston to be with Joseph Kennedy, the president's father, and Mrs. Kennedy. But Mr. Shriver apparently is in charge of funeral arrangements because the military is clearing through him the details. Meanwhile, the two children are at the White House. Mr. Shriver did not tell the children that their father was dead, even though he knew it when he visited them at the White House. Apparently no one else has told the children of the death of their father. One reason is that great birthday plans had been underway for the 6th birthday next Wednesday of Carolyn and the 3rd birthday on Monday for John. Next week was to have been a big week for the First family. There had been lots of fun and party plans underway for the two children to celebrate John's birthday actually on Monday, November the 25th, but they were going to celebrate on Tuesday because his playmates could be at the White House at that time. Party plans were also ready for Caroline on Wednesday. Caroline was to be the star at a big family birthday gathering with all her cousins at Cape Cod in Massachusetts. All of the Kennedys were to have been together for their traditional Thanksgiving gathering at Hyannisport on Thursday. And now, for the sad prospect of arrival of the party from Dallas to Washington, that's the presidential party, including President Lyndon Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, and Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, and the body of President Kennedy. They had left Dallas early in the afternoon. They're expected in Washington at 5:30. Now we take you for more detail on the arrival to Robert Goralski, NBC News, at the White House.
President Kennedy's body will lie in repose in the East Room of the White House tomorrow for 8 hours. The term lie in repose indicates a private funeral arrangement. He will later lie in state in the Capitol building. The new president, Lyndon Johnson, who arrives in Washington in something like 45 minutes from now, will proceed immediately from Andrews Air Force Base in nearby Maryland to the White House, where he'll go into a meeting with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and McGeorge Bundy, who is President Kennedy's advisor on national security matters. At 8 o'clock this evening, President Johnson will meet with the bipartisan leadership of the Congress. While President Kennedy's body lies in repose in the East Room of the White House tomorrow, his family will view him first, beginning at 10 o'clock in the morning. They will be followed by President Johnson, by the Speaker of the House of Representatives, John McCormick, former Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, and members of the executive branch of the government who hold presidential appointments. In the afternoon, members of the Supreme Court and members of the federal judiciary will also view President Kennedy's body. At 2:30, members of the Senate, members of the House, and the governors of the 50 states and territories, and at 5 o'clock, members of the diplomatic corps will view the body of President Kennedy in the East Room of the White House. President Johnson will make his first statement as President of the United States when he lands at Andrews Air Force Base at 6:05 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, approximately 40 minutes from now. This is Robert Goralski, NBC News, reporting from the White House.
Robert Goralski, will you hang on a moment there? We now have from the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue the report that President Johnson will meet at the White House tonight with Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and the White House National Security aide, McGeorge Bundy, and then he will confer with the bipartisan leadership of Congress. I didn't catch whether you covered that part of it or not. It seems to be very important all around the world now that we know the possible nature of the assassination of the president, possibly a plot not by the communist world itself, but by one of its misguided followers. It is important that the continuity of government and the national defense be stressed at this time. That's one reason why 6 cabinet members are flying back, who were on the way to Tokyo, flying back to Washington, and will arrive early tomorrow morning. And now we understand that we have more detail on the possible solution of the assassination of President Kennedy. Let's go again to WFAA in Dallas, to Tom Perryman. Will you come in, Tom?
The report we have right now is that Governor Connelly, also shot, is reported in satisfactory condition. Dr. Robert Shaw says he'll have to stay in the hospital at least 2 weeks. Also, we have an eyewitness report to the shooting, and would like for you to hear that now.
I am L.J. Lewis, 500 East Jefferson Avenue in Oak Cliff. And we were sitting in the office here, and we heard the shots. And I just casually made a remark. I said, I bet they have him cornered. And so I looked up the street and saw the suspect coming down the street, and he was reloading his revolver and stuck it in his belt when he got, just across the street from us. And he turned and went up the street, and I immediately phoned the police, and one of the boys here in the office, Warren Reynolds, and Pat Patterson, they followed the suspect up the street where he turned behind the service station and to the alley. I immediately phoned the police, and Warren and Pat Patterson, followed the suspect on up the street. And after that, it's just by the time, till all the police and everything were around here.
That was the voice of L.J. Lewis, an eyewitness to the assassination of President Kennedy. We have some reaction here to the shooting, and would like to call in Roger Reddy here at WFAA for that report.
A salesman traveling on the road called the newsroom at WFAA and made mention of the fact that as he heard the information of President Kennedy's death on the radio while traveling through Waco, north through Texas on the highways, he noticed that all along the way, truck drivers were pulled off to the side of the road and in parking areas, and they were openly weeping and sobbing. Passengers in cars had pulled off to the road and were talking quietly in a numbed manner. Also, some were weeping. The entire scene on the Texas highways reflected the sadness of President Kennedy's demise. All social and civic functions have been canceled in the Dallas area for the weekend, too. Dallas schools, however, did remain in session.
Thank you, Roger Reddy. One final note, Morgan. Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy at Parkland Hospital took her ring off and put it on John F. Kennedy's hand. She lifted the president's hand and kissed it. One final note. That's the story from Dallas, Morgan Beatty.
Thank you, Tom. And now, for those who may just have tuned in, this report is continuous on the assassination of President Kennedy at 12:30 p.m. At least he was shot at that moment. And his death at 1 p.m. in Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas.
We pause 10 seconds for station identification.
On behalf of the management and employees of WLW-Radio and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation, we join with our listeners in an expression of deep regret on the death of our president today.
An interesting note from Washington. Senate Minority Leader Everett M. Dirksen, the Illinois Republican, said this afternoon that Senate leaders had met and decided not to go to Andrews Air Force Base to meet the presidential party. It's due to arrive, as you've heard, at 6:05 p.m., and the president's body will be taken immediately to arrive at the White House at 6:30. Dirksen said this. We felt this would be an intrusion at the time when grief and shock is so intense. Normally, when the president returns to Andrews Air Force Base, an honor guard of 16 men is there to meet him. Tonight, the number was doubled to 32, plus 6 to stand by to act as pallbearers as needed. All of the 38 are from Air Force Honor Guard. Air Base officials report they understand Secret Service men probably would act as pallbearers on the arrival of the president's body about 36 minutes from now. Wilson Hall reports from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, that the switchboard at the American embassy there is jammed with calls from Brazilians who either cannot believe President Kennedy is dead or those who do believe it and offer condolences. People going home from work, you know they're 3 hours ahead of New York time, are stopping at the American embassy to ask if the news could be true. A crowd of Brazilians is outside the embassy waiting for further word and the reason why the assassination. Already, as you know, we're getting word that it may be a part of the Cold War, a fanatical wing of Fidel Castro's Fair Play for Cuba group. A man who has said he wishes to be a Russian citizen is being detained by the Dallas police. They have reported they are questioning him intensely. They are not yet giving the witnesses to the assassination a chance to see the man until they get through completely with their interrogation. Incidentally, as we've told you, President Charles de Gaulle of France has issued a statement that stresses very specifically the friendship of France for the people of the United States and its government. That's because there's been a cooling in recent months of relations between France and the United States. Now President de Gaulle has sent a personal message to Mrs. Kennedy. It says this: the immense sorrow which has stricken you moves my wife and me from the bottom of our hearts. Please accept our assurance that we are with you in thought and in prayer. President Kennedy will never be forgotten. Senator Dirksen, as we've noted, has acted as a spokesman for the Senate leadership at this moment. We can now take you to Washington for a statement from the senator in his own voice. Senator Dirksen in Washington.
Well, it's so incredible that in a free country, where people can so freely utter their opinions about anybody in public life, and in the parlance of the day, get it off their chest, that anyone could have such a congealed hate in his heart, or that he could have such a convulsive mind as to commit this kind of a heinous crime. When it happens in a country that's oppressed and under the iron heel of a dictator, where people are impoverished and all their liberties are destroyed, one can readily understand, I think, that sometime the restraints will burst and an untoward event will take place. But is there any conceivable excuse in the hardest of hearts for this kind of an act? And its impact will be enormous, not only on the country, but on the whole wide world.
A statement by Senator Dirksen of Illinois, the minority leader of the Senate, who has also announced that Senate leaders will not intrude at Andrews Air Force Base near Washington when the body arrives about 6:05 p.m. The party is on the way now. You may recall we reported that President Lyndon Johnson took the oath of office aboard a presidential plane just before the takeoff for Washington. Federal Judge Sarah T. Hughes of Dallas administered the brief oath of office to the Vice President. He looked very grim, and he turned, as soon as the oath had been administered, he embraced Mrs. Johnson, who's known in Washington as Lady Bird, and he embraced Mrs. Kennedy. Between 25 and 30 persons witnessed the swearing in the front compartment of a presidential plane. I believe it's Air Force Number 1 is the name of the plane where the swearing-in took place. The witnesses included Mrs. Evelyn Lincoln, Kennedy's personal secretary. After the president embraced his wife and Mrs. Kennedy, he turned to an Air Force officer nearby and said, "Okay, let's get this plane back to Washington." And they're on the way now. They'll be there in a few moments. As a sign of the growing mourning for the death of President Kennedy, we take you now to a scene in Fifth Avenue in New York, to Joseph Michaels at St. Patrick's Cathedral.
With the traditional Kyrie eleison, Bishop John J. McGuire began a mass for President Kennedy underneath the soaring arches of the great St. Patrick's Cathedral, which was crammed all the way out to Fifth Avenue. Thousands of people, many of them, one told me, and I could see for myself, non-Catholics, and this one person said that on this day he wanted to be in the Church of the Faith of the Brethren. Bishop McGuire called for the resurrection of the soul of John J. Kennedy, and after it was all over, he stood before the audience together with his assistants, and we all joined in the singing of the national anthem. stood there, not just watching, but participating, felt that the singing of the anthem was an act of faith in the country the president loved so well, and at the same time, an act of defiance of those who today defiled it. And that's the story of what has just been completed here on Fifth Avenue at St. Patrick's Cathedral, Morgan.
Thank you, Joseph Michaels. And now we have further details on the death room scene in Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas, between 12:30 and 1 o'clock this afternoon. Dr. Kemp Clark saw reporters, sadly, after the president had died. Dr. Clark hazarded a guess that the official record at this moment may have to be corrected, that the chief executive may have lived 40 minutes after he was carried into the room. Of course, there was no palpable pulse, but it's very difficult in such situations to tell. He said, "I was too busy to look at my watch." Dr. Perry was working on, that's Dr. Malcolm Perry, the associate of Dr. Clark, was working on the president's neck wound when the chief executive died. Dr. Perry said a bullet tore through at midline in the lower portion of his neck in the front. Was that just below the Adam's apple, a reporter asked, and he said yes. Dr. Clark said Kennedy, the president, was wounded in the back of the head. Now, that confirms earlier reports, or at least clears them up, that the president was wounded twice. He said he was wounded in the back of the head, and it was a large, gaping wound with considerable loss of tissue. And he made it clear that he meant brain tissue. When Mrs. Kennedy entered the hospital, the stocking on her left leg was saturated with blood. Once inside, she went to the Lyndon Johnsons, who were at the president's side, and the three clasped hands in deep emotion. Mrs. Kennedy still had on the blood-soaked stocking when she was taken from the hospital and witnessed the swearing-in of Lyndon Johnson as the 36th President of the United States. Now we have further reports on the young man Lee H. Oswald, who was arrested in connection with the assassination of the president. The Dallas police, as you may have remembered, report that this man is a prime suspect. That's all they will say. He has not been charged with anything as yet, and that they have said previously that he was a member of a Fair Play for Cuba committee, a group that was formed by Fidel Castro with 5,000 American dollars passed to American Fair Play for Cuba groups in the United States in New York. As we've noted, Lee Oswald, we now learn, was 24 years old. We're told that he was a one-time defector to Soviet Russia, and incidentally, he is suspected of killing a pursuing policeman who charged into the theater after the fleeing suspect had gone to the theater shortly after Kennedy and Governor John Connelly of Texas were shot. The policeman, incidentally, was slain with a .38 caliber snub-nosed weapon. The president was slain with a rifle, a German Mauser 7.65. The police say Oswald worked in the Texas School Book Deposition Building. That's the warehouse where the German Army Mauser was found after the assassination. 3 empty shells were found with the rifle on the 5th or the 6th floor. It hasn't been cleared up which floor. According to the police in Dallas, the suspect fired at policeman J.D. Tippett. Then he tried to shoot patrolman N.M. McDonald, but the weapon misfired. But Tippett died from the bullet that hit him. And as we reported before, Oswald put up a fight. He was subdued as a crowd of 600 people gathered outside the Texas Theater. That's the name of the theater, a suburban theater in the Oak Cliff district of Texas. Oswald accused the police of brutality. Cry Battle and War is Hell. Incidentally, Cry Battle and War is Hell were the names of the two films playing in the theater where the man had sought refuge. From Washington, Robert McCormick reports that the body of the president will lie in repose tomorrow at the White House, not in state. The body will lie in repose. There is a difference between a body lying in state and one lying in repose. When a body lies in repose, it is in private. The president's body will lie in state at the rotunda of the Capitol later, As we've noted to you, we've had the two sort of intermixed, and we'd like to clarify the point that the body will lie in the White House in repose, meaning that this is the private mourning period for the first family of the nation. On the dateline of Moscow, Saturday morning, Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko telephoned United States Ambassador Foy D. Kohler at midnight at the embassy residence Spaso House. Mr. Gromyko expressed his shock and the greatest sympathy to the American people. Official condolences will be conveyed later at the highest level, he told the ambassador. This presumably meant that Premier Khrushchev, who's been reported on vacation, by the way, in the last few days on the Black Sea, that Premier Khrushchev will either return to Moscow or in other ways make known the sincere grief of the Russian government at the death of President Kennedy. And from London, Sir Winston Churchill said tonight the assassination of President Kennedy is a monstrous act which has taken from us a great statesman and a wise and a valiant man. The World War II leader, will be 89 on November the 30th. He issued a statement from his London residence after listening to BBC television accounts of the president's death and the radio. The loss to the United States, said Sir Winston, and to the world is incalculable. Those who come after Mr. Kennedy must strive the more to achieve the ideals of world peace and human happiness and dignity to which his presidency was dedicated. A spokesman for Sir Winston said he and Lady Churchill sat up past 10 p.m., that is British time, to keep in touch with developments on television. I so well remember Sir Winston's statement at the death of President Roosevelt. He said his was an enviable death, meaning that it had come at the apex of his career. And he spoke almost as if he himself had wished that he could die at the apex of success at the end of World War II. In this case, of course, you have a much younger statesman, and Sir Winston's reaction was entirely different. This monstrous act, he said, has taken from us a great statesman and a wise and valiant man. The civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King, is reported to be in a state of shock at the news of President Kennedy's death. NBC News obtained from him, however, a statement. I am shocked and grief-stricken at the tragic assassination of President Kennedy, said Dr. Martin Luther King. He was a great and dedicated president. His death is a great loss to America and to the world. The finest tribute that the American people can pay to the late President Kennedy is to implement the progressive policies that he sought to initiate in foreign and domestic relations. From East Berlin, the East German communist leader Walter Ulbricht announced tonight he had learned the news of President Kennedy's death with sadness and deep indignation. He expressed sympathy for the American people who had lost one of the most outstanding statesmen. Among the ordinary people of East Berlin, the reaction was of shock and horror. An East Berlin taxi driver said, a great pity. We all liked him so much. In the past, they haven't shown that very much. Incidentally, the Chief Justice of the United States has issued a statement. Chief Justice Warren, he said today that President Kennedy was assassinated as a result of the hatred and bitterness that has been injected into the life of our nation by bigots. Perhaps Chief Justice Warren was thinking of the civil rights struggle when he issued his statement, because at that time it was unknown to him, could not have been known to him, that the suspect in the hands of the police is a man connected with the communist cause rather than the civil rights cause. There has been a profound reaction to the death of President Kennedy in Canada. Our Canadian friends, despite our differences, are always closer to us than any other people. We take you now to Leaf Eid in Ottawa.
A deeply shaken Prime Minister Lester Pearson announced the news of President Kennedy's death to Canada's House of Commons. An aide walked to his front bench shortly before the beginning of the afternoon session and handed him a slip of paper. In a voice that was close to the breaking point several times, the Prime Minister told a hushed Commons that the President's death is a tragedy for all of us, No people, he said, will share more deeply in that tragedy than the people of Canada, the neighbors of the United States. He said, our hearts are filled with sadness. The Prime Minister was a long-time personal friend of the late President, dating from the time when Mr. Pearson was Canadian ambassador to Washington and Mr. Kennedy was a senator. The Prime Minister's tribute was followed by those of the other party groups, and Commons immediately adjourned until Monday. All Canadian radio and television stations broke schedules to carry uninterrupted news of the President's assassination and to recall his 1961 visit to Canada. Lead NBC News, Ottawa.
Ladies and gentlemen, it occurred to us that you perhaps would like to hear the speech that President Kennedy was to have delivered just after his assassination in Dallas, Texas. He would have said this: "My friends and fellow citizens, I cite facts and figures to make it clear that America today is stronger than ever before. Our adversaries have not abandoned their ambitions. Our dangers have not diminished. Our vigilance cannot be relaxed. But now we have the military, the scientific, and the economic strength to do whatever must be done for the preservation and the promotion of freedom. That strength will never be used in pursuit of aggressive ambitions. It will always be used in pursuit of peace. It will never be used to promote provocations. It will always be used to promote the peaceful settlement of disputes. We in this country," the late President was to have said, "in this generation are by destiny rather than choice the watchmen on the walls of world freedom. We ask, therefore, that we may be worthy of our power and responsibility, that we may exercise our strength with wisdom and restraint, that we may achieve in our time and for all time the ancient vision of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. That must always be our goal, and the righteousness of our cause must always underlie our strength. For as was written long ago, except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain." If the President of the United States had known he was going to die, his speech on an occasion to have followed his assassination could never have been more thoughtfully conceived to mark his tragic end. John Lavacek reports from Miami that Havana Radio has just broken into its regular news broadcasts very belatedly with a bulletin and is broadcasting the news of President Kennedy's death to the Cuban people. The radio announcer in Havana on Fidel Castro's radio is a woman. She's broadcasting a press association dispatch from the United States. She is giving all the information she has at the time. All other nations apparently broke into the radio immediately. But in Cuba, they waited. Now they know that a Fair Play for Cuba committeeman, an American citizen, one of their sympathizers, is a prime suspect, that's the definition of the Dallas police, in the assassination of President Kennedy. The British ambassador, Sir David Ormsby Gore, as you may recall in some of your reading or listening on the air, was a particularly close friend of President Kennedy, and that stems from the days when Joseph Kennedy, his father, was ambassador in Great Britain. Sir David Ormsby Gore has issued this brief statement: "This horrible, wicked, and senseless act has deprived not only the American people, but the world of a great and wonderful man. Jack Kennedy was the best and most loyal friend one could ever hope to have, and I feel a sense of loss beyond description." That, of course, that last sentence is a reference to his very close personal friendship with the man who was President of the United States. Incidentally, we have more detail on the man Oswald, who was arrested in Dallas as a prime suspect in the death of President Kennedy. As we've noted before, the man had obtained a job in the warehouse, the textbook repository in Dallas. It was empty at the time. It was being refurbished for some reason or another. He had obtained a job in that building, and the shots that killed the president were fired from it. And as we've noted before, Oswald's supervisor said the man had been in the building at noon. That's the last time he had seen him. The shooting took place about 12:30. And now further details. Suspect Oswald is reported to have a Russian wife. On November the 1st, 1959, he told the U.S. Embassy in Moscow that he had applied for Soviet citizenship. He said he had been a tourist in Russia since October the 13th of the year 1959. Oswald returned to his Fort Worth home from Russia last year. He apparently had become disillusioned by life in the Soviet Union. Incidentally, the questioning is proceeding in Dallas, and of course it includes the shooting of both the policeman who was shot near a theater in a suburb of Dallas and the shooting of the president. According to Carlos Bringuier of the Cuban Student Directory in New Orleans, Oswald was in New Orleans 2 months ago as the chairman of a pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba committee. Oswald and several Cubans were arrested 2 months ago in the Louisiana city, that's New Orleans, for passing out allegedly pro-communist literature. Edward Scannell Butler III of the Information Council of the Americas reports that he and Oswald once debated communism. He said Oswald had renounced his United States citizenship and went to the Soviet Union to marry a Russian. Police had a Dallas address for Oswald. A caption on a photograph in the United Press International photo offices in New York shows Oswald in a hotel room in Moscow on November the 14th, 1959. He had served in the U.S. Marines and wore a Marine-style crew haircut in the picture that was taken in Moscow. He had joined the Marine Corps when he was 17 years old. He had sought citizenship in Russia. He told UPI correspondent Aline Mosby in Moscow this. That was in 1959. Quote, "It was like getting out of prison when he left America to seek Soviet citizenship." He had vowed he never would return to the United States. At the time of his trip to Moscow, he mentioned he would like to go to Cuba to join Fidel Castro. The Soviets, he said, refused him citizenship. Oswald speaks Russian. He had a child by a Russian wife. Oswald returned to the United States in 1962, stating that lack of money while a child and imperialism, his word, had led him to renounce his native land. Captain Will Fritz, the head of the Dallas Homicide Division, reports that Oswald told him he was a pro-Castro man and that he had lived in Russia. Oswald was handcuffed and had minor facial cuts when he was brought into police headquarters. Police said he had a sullen look, and Captain Fritz adds this, quote, "Oswald hasn't admitted anything yet, but he looks like a good suspect. He came from Fort Worth, where his family was respected. He had 2 brothers who were veterans, and his father was a veteran. Police describe him as a cool character under questioning." The policeman who was killed was, of course, J.D. Tippett, as we've told you. He was slain, and his fellow officers, Officer M.N. McDonald, chased the suspect into a rear exit of the Texas Theater. Apparently the man was trapped. Tippett and McDonald had received a tip that the assassin of President Kennedy might have gone into the theater. An usher told them a man in a brown shirt had entered the darkened theater a few moments before. According to police headquarters, Tippett fired a shot. McDonald rushed the suspect, and the suspect said, "It's all over now." McDonald and the suspect sprawled over a seat in the theater. McDonald's face was slashed. Police said it was a 4-inch gash inflicted by the suspect. It was in the cornering, apparently, that policeman Tippett was shot. And now, if we may summarize on the suspect in the assassination of President Kennedy. Dallas, Texas state line. Lee H. Oswald, a 1959 defector to Russia and chairman of a pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba committee, was placed in jail today after questioning in police headquarters as the prime suspect in the assassination of the president. He was battered and sullen. The 24-year-old suspect was also accused of slaying the policeman who chased him into a theater shortly after Kennedy was shot and Governor John Connelly was wounded. He was seized by another officer, McDonald, as we reported to you. The policeman he shot was named Tippett. Oswald wore a white shirt and dark trousers. Their first description, the police's first description, was that the man was wearing a brownish-colored jacket. Such a jacket was found in a parking lot of a funeral home near the theater where the man was seized. The man Oswald has got black, curly hair. He's about 5 feet 8 inches tall, 24 years old. He weighs about 160 pounds. Incidentally, recheck on the hair. It is light brown. At first, reports had it black. Within a few minutes from this moment, a presidential plane from Dallas, Texas, bearing the body of President Kennedy, President Lyndon Johnson, and Mrs. Lady Bird Johnson, and Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy will arrive in Andrews Air Force Base near Washington, D.C. The body will be taken immediately to the White House, where it will lie in repose. That is, it will lie for private mourning by the presidential family and others who are close. And then it will be taken, of course, to the Capitol Rotunda for a lying in state and for the nation's mourning. President Johnson took the oath of office before he left Dallas, Texas, with a woman federal judge giving him the oath. He then embraced Mrs. Kennedy Johnson, and he turned to the pilot of the plane and said, "All right, let's get this plane going on the way to Washington." The assassination took place about 12:30. President Kennedy died either about 1 or 1:10 p.m. today at the Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. In Dallas, Texas, the doctors report 2 wounds, 1 in the neck and 1 in the brain. There has been a special honor guard named at Andrews Air Force Base, 32 airmen, to act either as pallbearers or as escort as needed. The Defense Department, by a recent law enacted by the Congress, is in charge of funeral plans for the President, and his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, is in touch in the name of the family with Pentagon officials who will be in charge of the funeral. President Lyndon Johnson, on the arrival of the plane, will take a helicopter to the White House, just as President Kennedy did so many, many times. Sergeant Shriver, by the way, has gone with his wife Eunice, the President's sister, to Boston to be with Joseph P. Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy, the parents of the President. When they were told of his death, incidentally, they had not one word to say. They were too shocked. Sergeant Shriver will be with them, and Eunice Kennedy and many others in the Kennedy family are in Boston with the President's father and mother. Presumably, they will return to the White House tonight. But President Johnson has taken the oath. He was automatically, on the death of the President, he was made President of the United States, the second in command of our nation at this time is Speaker of the House of Representatives, John McCormick. 6 cabinet officers who had been on the way from Honolulu to Tokyo for a trade and commerce meeting with the new Japanese government. It's liberal and pro-American. These 6 men, headed by Secretary Dean Rusk, are now returning to the United States.
We pause 10 seconds for station identification.
This is the nation station, WLW in Cincinnati. WLW-Radio is suspending our regularly scheduled programs during this time of mourning for our late President, John F. Kennedy. We ask you to join with us in prayer for John Kennedy, his family, and President Lyndon Johnson.
I call him that now. He has renounced his title. We have a statement from Rabbi Israel Moskowitz, the president of the New York Board of Rabbis. He says, all Americans, regardless of race or creed or political affiliation, are joined in profound grief and sorrow at the tragic death of our great and beloved President John F. Kennedy. The assassin's bullet will all the more firmly enshrine him in the hearts and history of a grateful country, which is the beneficiary of his many inspired acts of statesmanship and devotion to our country and to the cause of world peace. The New York Board of Rabbis, says Rabbi Moskowitz, calls on all synagogues in our community to hold services of tribute to his blessed life and memory. May this tragic hour for America and the world cause all of us to rededicate ourselves anew with greater vigor to the democratic ideals of our blessed land to which President Kennedy gave such magnificent leadership. It is significant that the tone of that message follows exactly the tone of the message left with us by former President Dwight Eisenhower, who spoke of our national loss, who spoke of the importance of the presidency and our gathering together, our coming together behind a tragic event of this kind. Incidentally, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who steps from an airplane at Andrews Air Force Base in a very few minutes, is a man of tremendous energy. He's 6'3", 200 pounds. He was born on August the 27th, 1908, near Johnson City, Texas. His grandfather had said of him at that time, he'll be a United States Senator someday. His grandfather could never have known, of course, that he would miss the mark. But his first estimate was fair. The new chief executive first entered political life in December 1931, secretary to Representative Richard M. Clayburgh of Texas. 6 years later, Mr. Johnson himself was elected to the 75th Congress, the victor over 10 opponents in a special election. The former President Franklin Roosevelt personally encouraged Johnson to run for the Senate because at the time that happened, in 1941, the incumbent in office, Morris Shepherd, had died. Johnson lost by a slim margin but retained his seat in the House. On December the 8th, 1941, the day after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the lanky Texas congressman, a lieutenant commander in the Naval Reserve, became the first member of Congress to enter active military service. He was awarded a Silver Star for gallantry on bombing missions in the South Pacific before leaving the service in 8 months after a presidential order exempting national legislators from military duty. That order, incidentally, almost ordered legislators to remain at their desks in Washington.
The Broadcasting Corporation and its employees, as the rest of the nation, are deeply shocked by the untimely death of President Kennedy. His death has struck at the heart and conscience of America and the world, and his loss will be mourned for years to come. We of the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation.
WLW Radio is suspending our regularly scheduled programs during this time of mourning for our late President, John F. Kennedy. We ask you to join with us in prayers for John Kennedy, his family, and President Lyndon Johnson. At this time, we would like to introduce various notables here in the area of the Ohio Valley. The impact of the news of the president's assassination went round the world. It was a blow to the common man as well as to the leaders of the nation and the world. Here in Cincinnati, people reacted as though they had suffered a personal loss, as though a bomb had dropped. Crowd gathered downtown as they listened. As the news trickled in about the president, the people stood quietly, saying little, and there were tears showing in the eyes of some. The flags throughout the city, as in the rest of the nation, were dropped to half-mast as the first word of Kennedy's death reached them. The shock was so great that Lieutenant Mering in the helicopter flying over the Queen City area reported a heavy exodus of vehicles from the downtown. And apparently, people were so overwhelmed by the news that they just left their jobs and offices and went home. Here now, Mr. John T. Murphy, President of the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation.
Mr. John T. Murphy, President of Crosley Broadcasting Corporation.
The Crosley Broadcasting Corporation and its employees, as the rest of the nation, are deeply shocked by the untimely death of President Kennedy. His death has struck at the heart and conscience of America and the world, and his loss will be mourned for years to come. We of the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation join the rest of the nation in expressing our heartfelt sympathy to Mrs. Kennedy and the other members of the late president's family.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy.
Here in Cincinnati at the W.E. Hutton and Company, the stock board flashed the news of the president's death. People just stood and watched. No talk, no movement, just shocked. The news hit the streets quickly, and the newsboy's cry sent pedestrians into a stunned reaction. The people on the streets reacted as they could. Some could speak, some could not. Reaction from business, religious, and civic leaders was immediate, and regardless of political affiliations, their feelings were all the same: shock, sorrow, anger, and dismay. These were some of the many to express their feelings for WLW. Congressman Rich, Republican of the 1st District of Ohio.
Congressman Rich, how did you feel when you first heard the news of the assassination?
Well, I feel terrible. I can't realize yet that it's true. After all, President Kennedy was a world leader, the leader of the free world. He was our president, the president of everyone. And I am so personally deeply distressed. I know the whole nation is, and I'm sure the whole world will pray for the safety of America. My deepest sympathy to the Kennedy family, one of the greatest families in Americans' history.
Thank you, Congressman Rich.
These words from the former congressman from Cincinnati, chairman of the Hamilton County Republican Committee, Mr. Gordon Shearer.
Sir, what was your reaction to the death of the president?
Well, it's almost unbelievable that a tragedy like this can happen in the United States today. I have no idea what diabolical forces were behind this assassination, but it demonstrates clearly how dangerous to our security one or two persons can be. I only knew the president slightly, but this brutal killing has completely upset me, Glenn.
Thank you.
From a prominent Cincinnati civic leader and president of the Kroger Company, Mr. Joseph Hall.
Mr. Hall, what was your reaction to the death of President Kennedy?
Well, it was unbelievable to me that in this country and in this day of age that this could happen. It has been my privilege to attend several meetings in the White House and to listen to our president discuss many of the serious and important problems. One could not help but listen to him without realizing that he had a full grasp of what was happening in the country and an understanding of the problems and a sincere desire to try to do something about them. One could not leave the meeting without having the respect for our president.
This is WLW Radio in Cincinnati, now returning you to NBC.
And the Navy ambulance moves off with the casket.
The ambulance is going to the other side of this airport. It is supposed to deliver the casket to the helicopters that are standing by.
The ambulance moving past the Guard of Honor, a cordon of soldiers, airmen lining the field here, and behind them thousands of young airmen from Andrews Air Force Base who have come here up to the fence to see.
The Secret Service man comes down the steps of the airplane. Now, new President Lyndon Baines Johnson with his wife, Lady Bird. They're coming down the steps. They are followed by Johnson aides, including Mrs. Carpenter, Mr. Bill Moyers, former Congressman Homer Thornberry,
the head of the Secret Service on the President's right. Secretary McNamara and other officials greeting the new President. As he moved...
Affectionately kissed Mrs. Johnson.
This report is coming to you from Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, the arrival of the plane carrying the body of our late President, John F. Kennedy.
The one he wrote aboard the airplane on his way back to Washington. President Johnson, in the statement, first public statement as Chief Executive of the United States, today promised the nation to do his best in new and grave responsibility. He asked divine guidance in the task.
Baines Johnson, who has been the Chief Executive of the United States for a few hours only after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, has now advanced to a bank of microphones set up beside the plane, where he has just arrived from Dallas, Texas. He is standing there and will make his first statement as the new President of the United States. Beside him is Mrs. Johnson. They are standing soberly, quietly. He looks about him. The body of the slain president has departed Andrews Air Force Base just outside Washington. Mrs. Kennedy rode with the body of her husband to the White House. Vice President Johnson.
For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
The new President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and Mrs. Johnson, has started to walk to the helicopter, and then the head of the Secret Service, Mr. James Rowley, brought him back to shake hands with the great number of dignitaries who have come here to pay their respect to the slain President and to greet the new President of the United States. In the crowd, shaking hands with the new President Johnson, is Mike Mansfield, the Democratic Senate Majority Leader, the Republican Leader, Everett Dirksen of Illinois, Senator Aiken of Vermont is also in the crowd. Speaker John McCormick was here just a moment ago and is in the large group of people that have now clustered about President Johnson. The tall Texan stands out because of his height from those around him. He shakes hands with W. Averill Harriman, the Undersecretary of State. Shortly after the death of President Kennedy this afternoon, the acting Secretary of State, George Ball, notified all of the governors of the United States, all of the heads of missions of the diplomatic corps in Washington, and all the consular missions overseas, as well as the U.S. diplomatic missions overseas. Here at the airport, a great number of diplomats have gathered to pay their respects to the late President Kennedy and to greet President Lyndon Johnson. Among them, the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, Ambassador Sevilla Sacasa of Nicaragua, lift was slowly lowered to the ground, where the body of the president was received by another honor guard standing on the apron itself. At that point, a gray United States Air Force ambulance moved up into position, and the bronze casket was placed aboard ambulance for the ride into Washington. The forklift then went back up to the side of the plane, and Mrs. Kennedy, holding hands with the president's brother, the Attorney General, stood as the lift slowly lowered Mrs. Kennedy and the Attorney General down to the ground and the rest of the presidential party.
And they prepare for the sad trip, a very brief one, to the White House aboard the helicopter, where the body will lie in repose tomorrow. It's been announced that President Johnson will confer tonight with the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. There is significance in such a conference because President Truman and President Eisenhower, before President Kennedy, had arranged for similar brief meetings with vice presidents. Vice President Johnson, that is, President Johnson, when he was vice president, was kept briefed on every aspect of our national affairs, particularly national security. There will be no need for any more than a formal conference to take over, noting any wishes that the president may have at this time. And so the party goes to the White House. It hasn't been revealed whether Mrs. Kennedy had a chance to change that blood-soaked stocking on the way from Dallas to Washington. She probably paid no attention to it whatever. We have a statement now from a Protestant leader on behalf of the country's 3.5 million Episcopalians, the Right Reverend Arthur Lichtenberger. He's presiding bishop of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the USA. He says this, and we quote him directly. The whole world is shocked and saddened at the news of the assassination of our president. May God in his infinite goodness receive him into the life abundant. I join with men and women everywhere in our expression of grief and assure the family of President Kennedy of our continuing prayers. We thank God for the integrity and courage of John Kennedy. He has given his life for his country. That's about the 5th time there has been a reference to the fact that President Kennedy has given his life for his country just like a soldier gives his life on a battlefield, because certainly exposure of their bodies by presidents is an act of devotion in itself, and all presidents go all of it. Ladies and gentlemen, the NBC radio network will stay on the air with continuous coverage of the tragic death of President Kennedy until 1 a.m. Eastern Time tonight. And we will resume coverage of A Nation in Mourning and all the events that surround it. We will resume at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time Saturday, tomorrow morning, with continuous coverage. From Dallas, Texas, the report that federal, state, and local authorities have coordinated their search for anyone who may have been connected with the assassination of President Kennedy at 12:30 p.m. in Dallas, Texas today. One of the most determined and yet invisible manhunts in history is underway. Of course, they have a suspect, called by the Dallas police a prime suspect, in the person of Lee Oswald, a 24-year-old young man who once defected to Russia, who is known to be an admirer of Fidel Castro. They have this man in custody. But there are evidences in the circumstances of the assassination that it was well planned and possibly more than one person took part in it. Therefore, a manhunt is underway just in case that Oswald turns out to be not the man, or in case, if he should be the man, there are others involved with him. The killer now, the police now report they believe, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the president's killer had been hiding in the upper story of the textbook storage building, the warehouse, commanding an unobstructed view of the presidential cavalcade. The place where the president was slain was selected with infinite care, diabolical care. We've told you before that the Great White Way of Broadway is not as white as it usually is, especially on week. A special order has gone out that has closed all of the live Broadway shows. We take you now to the New York Theater District, to Joseph Michaels, NBC News, Times Square.
I can see a sign opposite me which says 6:23. That, of course, is New York time. It comes to my mind primarily because it's one of the few signs that you can see here on Times Square. We're right in the heart of it tonight. You can walk across the street with great ease, and you are not going to have the full light of day that you usually have that's associated with this great center of New York's playland. The Paramount Theater with its huge sign, the big NBC sign across the way, the waterfalls that are usually lit up for the astonishment of the visitors to this city, all are quiet tonight. So are the theaters of the city. There are 33 Schubert theaters throughout the country, which we are told have been closed by the Schuberts voluntarily tonight. Other theaters in the city are all closed down. The refunds will be made, we are told, during the course of coming time. Most of the theaters are not worried about this tonight. They are taking a substantial loss, almost $250,000, $200,000. We noticed something interesting, and we have just called two young ladies over because they're carrying signs, and the signs said that the new frontier must live despite what has happened. Girls, when did you get the idea of making these signs?
We were sitting and talking about it, and the time was passing. We heard that he was dead. And then, right then and there, we decided there was something we had to do. We couldn't just sit there and do nothing when he was dead.
Well, why did you do it?
We felt we had to show that other people are concerned, that people are against him.
Thank you very much. Well, these are just two young people who, on their own, decided that they had to do something for the things in which President Kennedy believed, and this was their spontaneous demonstration to come down here from their school to Times Square with these signs. They have gathered just about the only crowd that one can see in this square. Usually it's just starting to move at this time of night, people hustling to the theaters, other people on their way homes, but tonight all is quiet here. In the middle of the square, just put up today for the Volunteers of America for a charity, a great big jovial Santa Claus, looking ironical indeed and tragically so under the circumstances. He stands there with his bell held up and his green glove and his white beard and a jolly ho-ho expression on his face, which absolutely nobody here feels, Morgan.
Anything further to report from that area?
No, just quiet in New York. The theater attendance, as you know, has been called to a halt. The movies are closed. Only a few shops are open in the city. Just people going on their way quietly, unprecedented quiet. There's been nothing like this here in Times Square, I'm sure, since the night of the death of Franklin Roosevelt.
I was just going to ask you how it looks in Times Square without it being bright as day in the nighttime.
It just is almost too weird to be believed. The cigarette sign that's usually puffing smoke at the people is completely shut down. The signs that usually are flickering and dashing and darting are all gone. And the traffic moves through quite freely. It just isn't the Times Square that all of us knew, or all of us can remember. It's hardly the gay white way. There's nothing gay about it at all. It's, I'm told by those who were here at that time, but the closest resemblance that one can find, that it looks as it did very much during the war.
Thank you, Joseph Michaels.
All right, Morgan, that's the picture here.
We have reported earlier than now that an extraordinary effort has been underway to impress all nations throughout the world of the continuity of the United States government. Some nations do not have such continuity. Another illustration of this, a report that the first White House Cabinet meeting under President Lyndon Johnson will begin exactly 3 minutes from now. As you know, critical cabinet officers are in Washington, especially Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. One very important officer is not there. With 5 other cabinet officers, Secretary of State Dean Rusk is on his way to Washington from Honolulu. Dean Rusk and the other 5 officers were on their way to Tokyo when they were notified of the president's death, turned back. They're due in Washington just after midnight Saturday morning. Nevertheless, President Lyndon Johnson has called the first cabinet meeting to proceed at once without Secretary of the Treasury Douglas Dillon, without Secretary of the Interior Udall, or Freeman of Agriculture, or Hodges of Commerce, or Wirtz of Labor. They had planned a conference in Tokyo on trade that was to have begun Monday. And now, a brief pause.
The NBC radio network will stay on the air with continuous coverage until 1 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will resume broadcasting at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time Saturday tomorrow with continuous coverage. We pause now 10 seconds for station identification.
This is WLW in Cincinnati. WLW Radio is suspending our regularly scheduled programs during this time of mourning for our late President, John F. Kennedy. We ask you to join with us in prayer for John Kennedy, his family, and President Lyndon Johnson.
His body is now on the way to Bethesda Naval Hospital just outside of Washington. The purpose for that trip is official, a sad official duty in the case of the death of a president of the United States in this manner. A routine autopsy will be performed at the Naval Hospital. Later, the body will be removed to a Washington funeral parlor. That's later tonight. And it will be tomorrow that the body will be taken to the White House, where it will be put on view in repose in the East Room of the White House. The Kennedy family and the leading officials of the United States government will view it there. The body will be in repose, as we've explained to those who heard us earlier, because that is a sign of private mourning. So the top officials of the United States that go to the White House tomorrow will go there because they are personal friends as well as official associates of the President of the United States. And ahead of Mrs. Kennedy is the saddest, the most difficult task of all, aside from being present helplessly at the shooting and at the death of her husband. The task of notifying Jacqueline and John Jr. that their father is gone. We have no more details on the arrest of young Lee Oswald in Dallas, Texas. There seems to be no question about it that the thoroughness of this interrogation takes precedence over all other aspects. The police are of the continued belief in Dallas, we have no word from federal authorities, of course, as yet, that they have a prime suspect in the person of Lee Oswald, the 24-year-old American who once defected to Russia and who later expressed his admiration for Fidel Castro. This young man has also been in New Orleans. He has led anti-American activities in various parts of the United States. It is difficult to understand why he didn't stay in Russia when he was there. Incidentally, the United Nations announces that Secretary General U Thant will attend the funeral of President Kennedy in the name of the 101, I believe it is, member nations of the United Nations. The President of the General Assembly, Carlos Sousa Rodriguez, and other top officials will accompany U Thant. A special memorial will be held at the General Assembly on Monday morning at about 10:30 a.m. in the United Nations building in New York. President de Gaulle has sent 2 messages to the United States to stress the friendship of France for our people and his love for the President of the United States. He considered that particularly important because of the strained relations between the 2 countries in recent months. It's also noteworthy that President de Gaulle has repeatedly pointed out that the differences between us shall never exist in emergency or in case of attack. Let's go now across the Atlantic again to Bernard Frizzell in Paris for more reaction in France.
The instant reaction in Paris to the death of President Kennedy was disbelief. Immediately after came deep shock. After that, horror. For President Kennedy had the affection of the French people, and they could not believe that so young a man, so young a president, could disappear so suddenly, the victim of an assassin's bullet. President de Gaulle, 73 years old today, and a target in the past of an army of assassins, declared, President Kennedy died like a soldier under fire, and he saluted the dead president in the name of the French people, describing them as a friend always of the American people. Hundreds of Americans gathered around the United States Embassy and along the Champs-Élysées, reading a special edition of the black-bordered Paris Herald with its headline crying, Kennedy assassinated. A concierge blew to her radio. I heard her saying simply, le pauvre, the poor man. This is Bernard Frizzell, NBC News, Paris.
In view of your very intimate knowledge and association with Frenchmen and with French politicians and French leaders, Bernard, would you care to hazard an estimate of the effect of this on Franco-American relations?
Yes, Morgan, I would certainly say that this is going to tie us even more closely to the French people than we have been tied to them in the past, because this is going to create an emotional link. I do not think that it will make very much difference on the official level, but certainly among the people here, there is no question that the reaction that they have had to this shocking event is one of the deepest mourning and the most considerable affection that I have ever seen displayed for a public figure in all the years that I have been in France.
And that is a significant reaction.
It certainly is, Morgan.
It will undoubtedly give President Charles de Gaulle more pause, more time for thought, and it is certainly a consolation to the people of the United States to feel a bit closer to Frenchmen the way it used to be than we did a few days ago. President George Meany of the AFL-CIO, the nation's largest labor organization, has sent a telegram to President Lyndon Johnson. He has pledged the full support of the nation's major labor organization to Mr. Johnson in his task as president. Mr. Meany also sent a telegram of condolence to Mrs. Kennedy. Incidentally, they are well acquainted, even though many people don't know it. The top official of the AFL-CIO learned of the assassination of President Kennedy while driving to Washington from New York. He had presided here in New York at this week's AFL convention and was going back into the task of running the great labor organization from Washington. Their major headquarters are there. As you probably know, both President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy were very concerned about the attitude of Texans, and particularly of Democrats in Texas, toward the chief executive before he went there. Not that he believed or she believed they weren't good, loyal Americans. That wasn't the point. The Texas Democratic Party is in a bit of a dither. It's having what it has had in the past on occasion, an attack of factionalism between Senator Yarborough and Governor John Connelly. They are, to use rather rough words, John Connelly leads the conservative elements of Texas and is a protege, by the way, of President Lyndon Johnson. And Senator Yarborough leads the liberal wing of the state. He's been a constant supporter of the New Frontier in nearly every one of its propositions before the Congress. So that's one reason why Mrs. Kennedy went to Texas with the president to sort of help him try to cement the two wings of the party in that state. And there were some signs in the various crowds that they've encountered there that certainly the two wings of the party had buried the hatchet to a certain extent. One side there said something to the effect that Goldwater in 1864, meaning that the Democrats don't want that man. The Republicans, many of them in Texas, are for Goldwater for president. And after the earlier morning meetings in Dallas today, and after a rather friendly meeting in San Antonio, although some party officials were not there, Mrs. Kennedy turned to her husband this morning before the tragic event, and she said, "You can't say that Dallas wasn't friendly to you." She made the remark as they rode past the cheering crowds in Dallas on the way to a rendezvous with death. Mrs. Kennedy today wore a stunning pink chipper pink pillbox hat. She had a bunch of yellow roses with her in the open-top White House limousine, although at one point she had been presented with red roses that clashed with her pink outfit. Those roses had been presented to her, by the way, the yellow ones, at the Dallas airport. They remained in the blood-spattered car outside the hospital as her husband lay dying inside. The scene of the President and Mrs. Kennedy in that awful hour, 12:30 p.m. Central Time today, has remained with many, many, many American citizens who saw much of it. Mrs. Kennedy clutched her husband to her as he slumped forward in the seat of the car. She knelt on the floor over him during the high-speed ride to Parkland's hospital emergency ward. She helped lift her dying husband onto the stretcher, and she was taken into the hospital and whisked from view. She appeared stunned as she entered the hospital. Physicians attending the president said they didn't take time to notice whether she or any members of the White House staff were with the president when he died. Members of the White House party said Mrs. Kennedy's first thought was to be with her children, Caroline and John Jr. Both of them have birthdays next week. And then, of course, she was taken immediately to Love Field in Dallas, where the White House party was to return to Washington. They have now arrived there. On the plane that carried her to what had been a personal triumph for her in Texas, she joined witnesses. There were 25 of them, all told. And she watched Lyndon B. Johnson sworn in to office as President of the United States. And she watched the casket of her husband placed solemnly aboard. Mrs. Johnson embraced Jacqueline Kennedy. And the three of them, President Lyndon Johnson, after he had taken the oath of office, and Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Kennedy joined hands briefly. And they all rode back to the Capitol with the new president. He himself is in the White House now. He has called the first cabinet meeting for 6:30. Presumably that's 10 minutes underway. If not, it will be shortly underway. And it is noteworthy that the First Lady, who is also at the White House, remained composed all the time she was at the hospital in Dallas and all the time on the way home. And she knew from the doctors, she was told on the way to Washington, that the doctors had told the party with the president that they had never had any hope of saving his life the minute they saw his wounds. One through the head, another through the neck. The first wound, the major one, had done considerable damage, brain damage. Tissue was destroyed. Apparently, the president had not regained consciousness. He was only for one instant aware that he'd been shot. As one eyewitness had said, in reference to that one instant, there was that awful look on his face, and he slumped forward to the floor where Mrs. Kennedy kneeled with him. Incidentally, at the oath-taking, aboard the plane, just before it returned to Washington, plane Air Force One, President Johnson put his hand on the Bible, his left hand, and he swore, as we are all familiar with the oath, to faithfully execute the duties of President and to defend the Constitution. And the oath, as we've noted, was administered by a United States District Judge, the first woman ever to administer the oath to the President of the United States. Incidentally, Mrs. Sarah T. Hughes, Judge Sarah T. Hughes, had been named to office by President John Kennedy in 1961. And now for a report on the inevitable trend of events in the center of Washington. To Ray Scherer at the White House in Washington.
Morgan, President Lyndon Johnson is holding his first function as President of the United States. He got out of the helicopter here at 6:26. First we saw red lights coming out of the sky, then we heard the roar of the chopper, then the lights went on, the door opened, out came Mrs. Johnson, then came Lyndon Johnson, and then came George Ball of the State Department, Secretary McNamara, Mr. Bundy, the President's Special Assistant for Security Affairs, Walter Jenkins, Assistant to President Johnson. They paused briefly in the lights. There were a few handshakes. President Johnson stopped to shake the hands of members of the press. His face looked very grave. He walked directly to his office, and he is now conducting business. A few minutes after he landed, another helicopter landed, and out came Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield and Senate Republican Leader Everett Dirksen. The others are gathered here. As soon as this security meeting is over, presumably he will meet with the leaders. Any questions?
I would like to point out, Ray, are you on with me?
Yes, I hear you, Morgan.
We've had very, very little difficulty with these circuits today. We can't call it fortunate, but it's fortuitous, at least, that we're having so little trouble with our circuits. Only one missed circuit since the death of the President. But I'd like to ask more, or call your attention.
Yes.
You have covered so many events in the White House. The heart attack, I remember you and I were on together for hours. When the heart attack occurred in
1955.
President Eisenhower's time. I believe none of our reporters is more competent or equipped to comment on this very insistent idea that the leaders of our nation are now conveying to us of the continuity of the American government. Foreigners are so little aware of that. Would you like to comment on that point?
Well, of course, President Johnson has been intimately in on everything that has happened having to do with foreign policy. He's made a number of trips to the President. He sits in on National Security Council sessions. He was with the President in his last hours. He's now back here immediately. He sits down with the cabinet members. There will be no possible lapse. What they're doing now is filling him in on every situation in which impinges on foreign and military affairs. Secretary McNamara is presumably going over what the situation is in Vietnam, how our forces are deployed in Germany, what the situation is vis-a-vis the Russians along the Autobahn, everything that could possibly flare up. And Mr. Bundy is, of course, filling him in on all sorts of vital security matters which are only privy to the President and his inner circle. Now they've been given to Mr. Johnson. The thing that strikes me about this whole occurrence today is that it again brings out what a thread of tragedy runs through the Kennedy family. Brother Joe was killed in a Navy plane crash, World War II. His sister was killed in a plane crash in 1945. The President was almost killed in World War II in the Pacific. Later, he almost died during an operation on his back. His father was felled by a stroke. Their son died in August, and now this.
Yes, it is to all of us the same, and I hardly need comment on the feeling of all Americans. The exceptions, I suppose, are so few we can ignore them at this time. Incidentally, yes. Ray Scherer, we have on with us the senior European correspondent of NBC in London, who also has dealt in the general areas of leadership that you're so familiar with. And he's on with us. Joseph C. Harsh, would you come in, Joe?
Yes, I'm here. I hear you.
Do you have any questions at the moment on what you would like answered about things here, or do you have some suggestions for us?
Morgan, one point I think I would like to make, if I can, is that we were all stunned when this thing happened, but But the tributes that have just come from all the leaders in this country are really quite remarkable. Prime Minister Sir Alec Hume has just done a long television statement about it, which starts out saying that at times when the mind and heart stand still, everything in one cries out in protest. And he went on for a long and eloquent tribute, followed by the leader of the opposition, Harold Wilson. Let's see, what did he say? He recalled the remark on Lincoln's death, now he belongs to the ages, and he said, that's the way we will think of the death of President Kennedy. Joe Grimman said that all through Britain, people will feel tonight that this is a totally unexpected personal tragedy. He will be deeply mourned for a very long time. Some of the morning newspapers are out now with the whole front page on this and nothing else. This is deeply felt over here.
It certainly serves to illustrate the intimacy of the alliance between the United States and Great Britain. I remember Lord Hume, when he was Lord Hume, instead of Sir Alex, remarking that he supported the United States primarily because of the realities. He loved this country, but he primarily thought of the realities of the fact that we were the prime power in the nuclear age, and it was only sensible that he would recognize the primacy of that power.
Morgan, may
yes.
I say that I think what you said there is tremendously important. I don't think I had realized until I saw the eloquence and the deep sincerity of the tributes here, how deep this thing really is. It does come out.
Ray?
Yes, Morgan.
I see that there's a funeral mass to be said Monday in the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington for President Kennedy, and that Richard Cardinal Cushing, his old friend, will preside.
We'll do the Mass.
Yes.
Morgan, I take it, are you up to date on the arrangements here tomorrow?
Yes, we're fairly up to date, but why don't you fill us in again? It won't hurt.
Well, the body will lie in repose. That's the phrase being used in the East Room. From 10 to 11 will be reserved for the family. At 11 o'clock, Vice President Johnson, Speaker McCormick, members of the Cabinet, and various men who hold executive appointments will appear in the room. At 2 o'clock, the Supreme Court, members of the Judiciary will view the body. At 2:30, members of the Senate and the House, governors of the states and territories, many of whom are en route to Washington at this moment, flying in. At 5 o'clock, members of the Diplomatic Corps. Presumably Sunday, the body would be moved to the Capitol.
Morgan, if I could break in...
Yes, Joe, do that.
There is one question I'd like to put to both you and Ray. Everyone I talk to here asks me what difference in policy there's going to be now that Lyndon Johnson is president instead of John F. Kennedy. I've been away from Washington so long that I do wish you'd fill me in.
Ray, you go first.
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. No one can answer that question. It's a question that we put to several senators earlier in the day. We put it, among others, to Senator Mansfield and to Senator Humphrey, both of whom are extremely close to the president. Their answer was that they foresaw no immediate differences in policy, although each president handles things differently. They said that President Johnson was thoroughly familiar with the workings of the Senate and House, having been a member of both, and that they thought there would be great continuity of policy.
I think there will be too, Joe, and I'll tell you why. Because, if you will recall, in past civil rights bills, even before President Kennedy was elected, that Lyndon Johnson presided over the great compromises. Now, I don't mean to call Lyndon Johnson a compromiser. I mean to say that this man has a deeper understanding of the factionalism of the South than has President Kennedy, even though the president has been friendly with many Southerners, such as the Virginians. He's been very close to several of the Virginians, including Governor Battle. But the point is that Lyndon Johnson has a certain touch about Southern politicians that President Kennedy didn't have. And now, I don't believe he's going to change President Kennedy's policies, for example, on civil rights. But I believe he will have a more coercive effect on Southerners, and the reason is because of the great tragedy. Sometimes things, we can never call them really fortuitous. We don't know, because you won't know for another generation the full significance of this. But if anything could pull this nation together and stop the divisions on foreign policy and on civil rights, if anything could do it, and some of our economic problems, I would say the assassination of our president is done. First, it's taken Americans out of their personal preferences in politics. It's taken them completely out.
Yeah.
They realize, what only we realize in great emergencies, that we are a nation after all, and we have no right to our personal preferences over other Americans. I think this has done that. And then in addition to that, it's given President Johnson the opportunity to pull all Americans together. I don't know why it had to be from such a tragic circumstance. He's got an opportunity of at least a generation. He's been effective in the past. Let's see how he does it. I know his own attitude is impatience in such matters, but he proceeds patiently. So we have a consummate politician who has rephrased that old axiom of American politics, that politics is the art of the possible. He has rephrased that. He doesn't say it's an art. He says that politics is the science of the possible. Now, this man has an opportunity to apply that science in a way that no other president in our memory has.
Now, let me ask another question that's come up here tonight several times. Is it not true that Lyndon Johnson has spent most of his political life dealing in domestic political and economic matters rather than in foreign politics? Does this mean that Dean Rusk is really going to be our foreign minister in all respects?
That's difficult. Ray, you have already made remarks about the fact that Lyndon Johnson has made many foreign trips for President Kennedy. I wonder if you'd like to extend those remarks.
Well, recently, it would almost seem that he has been away from Washington on trips more than he's been here. He went through all the Benelux countries. He's been all through the Far East. He presumably has an intimate face-to-face acquaintanceship with the leaders of Europe. What strikes me about Johnson is the fact that he was really an absolute whiz in running the Senate. He ran it by almost sheer force of personality, and as you say, he knew the arts of compromise. Well, the question is how well these talents can be adapted to the presidency, and I can only say we shall have to see.
But may I go back, though, and say, is it not true that in spite of these trips, which sometimes were involved some domestic politics, too, and didn't involve a serious study of high foreign policy, is it not true that in this area, Lyndon Johnson is fairly inexperienced?
I wouldn't think so, because he's been so close to the Foreign Affairs Committee on the Hill, and he's such a determined man, and he also has such an intimate knowledge of American views of all sorts, conservative, liberal, and his idea is to, as you'll remember, he had himself placed in charge of the space developments. He has a tremendous ambition for his country, but as I've noted before, he's always harnessing that ambition to fit the practical necessities in front of him. I would say, Joe, that he would have as deep an understanding of the art of British politics as any American would ever have, because he has followed the principles that British negotiators, shall we call that, between each other, followed for many years in Washington. Now, he will be a little more inept at it, perhaps, for a moment or two, but not for long.
You know, the one thing that struck me when this awful thing happened, I tried to adjust myself mentally to the facts of it, was a feeling that I looked out at the world, and here I had seen two men imbalanced. My mind goes back to the Vienna meeting, that first confrontation between Kennedy and Khrushchev, out of which seemed to emerge a new stability in the world, which consisted of the fact that John F. Kennedy could stand up to Nikita Khrushchev. Now, suddenly, you've taken that factor out, and what I can't yet feel is that I can see what's going to take the place of Kennedy in that balance. I'm worried. I'm anxious.
You have a right to be worried. We always do, because no man in that office has ever experienced totally for it, as you know. No. One office, that is the one defect in our government that is sometimes something better than a defect, but sometimes is very difficult. Every president has to learn our chief executive's job. As President Truman once said when Eisenhower was about to come to the White House, and he was a little bit diffident about sharing secrets and so forth and so on, President Eisenhower was diffident about coming to the White House, and President Truman said, well, all I want to do is tell him the problems he's going to have, and that he better watch out. Just wait till he pushes that button, and 6 months later turn around and find out nothing happened.
Yeah.
These experiences are going to have to be learned, but I would say that you'll remember that President Kennedy told Mr. Khrushchev at Vienna, it's going to be a cold winter, meaning we're not agreeing here at all. I don't think you'll find one whit of difference in the attitude of President Johnson and President Kennedy on that matter.
By the way, Morgan, I just had put in front of me a rundown on the front pages of all the morning London newspapers. It's interesting. Every one of them has used exactly the same headline, Kennedy assassinated. Mirror, Kennedy assassinated. Mail, Kennedy assassinated. Express, Kennedy assassinated. Telegraph, Herald, the whole lot of them. Everyone's used the same line.
And that's the only one that could use. A good copy reader couldn't find any more accurate line because it was...
I've never seen the London press all saying exactly the same thing before, though.
Oh? Very interesting indeed. It does go to show that the alliance between Britain and the United States, which always seems to be falling apart at the seams, is really never falling apart in emergency.
How right you
They
are.
have an absolute single interest. Ray, any further there?
No, there's a changing of the guard here, Morgan. A few minutes ago, a piece of mimeographed paper was put in my hands. I looked at the top remarks of President Johnson. Well, here was the first piece of paper with his name on it, and it came a little bit startling. It was the text of what he had said at the airport.
Has the cabinet meeting finished?
No, the cabinet meeting is continuing. It will go on for some time. At 8 o'clock, President Johnson plans to sit down, possibly a little earlier than that, with the leaders of the Senate and the House and see where he goes from there.
And then I believe he has a meeting with Secretary McNamara separately.
That's happening now. That's going on.
That's the one the cabinet meeting then is where he gets the full...
Well,
statement.
you know, a number of members of the cabinet are not here. They
That's
were
right.
on their way to Japan, and Secretary Rusk and others are flying back. Mr. Salinger, among others, with them. They presumably will get in sometime after midnight.
Well, thank you both very much.
The NBC radio network will stay on the air with continuous coverage until 1 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will resume broadcasting at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time Saturday, tomorrow, with continuous coverage. We pause now for 10 seconds for station identification.
This is WLW Cincinnati. WLW Radio is suspending our regularly scheduled programs during this time of mourning for our late President John F. Kennedy. We ask you to join with us in prayer for John Kennedy, his family, and President Lyndon Johnson.
About the death of President Kennedy were made to us by a highly competent observer, a senator from Texas, a liberal, a supporter of the New Frontier, Senator Ralph Yarborough. We have now a rare opportunity that comes in history for an eyewitness of this caliber, a man competent, highly able to observe thoroughly, an opportunity to hear him say exactly what happened from his point of view, because he was in the motorcade directly behind the president. We take you now to Nancy Dickerson, NBC News, Washington.
Yarborough, you've just returned on the presidential jet, come back from Texas, Dallas this morning. Could you describe the situation to us in the cavalcade when you were there and what happened after the shots were fired?
Well, they were booming shots. You could tell they were not firecrackers or pistols. They were either rifle shots or small bombs. But the Secret Service men were between the car that I was in with Vice President Johnson and Mrs. Johnson. We couldn't tell immediately what was going on, but after the first two shots, the Secret Service man in the front seat whirled us and told us to get down. And then we could tell that something very terrible was happening.
And then what happened? Did you all go to the hospital?
The cavalcade immediately speeded up at a very high speed and raced. It was some miles to the hospital. They raced past the place where the noon meeting was to be held, past the mark where thousands of people were gathered inside, and went directly to the hospital at a terrible rate of speed. This was a deed without a name. This was one of the most horrible crimes in American history, and it takes away the most brilliant leader I've ever known at a crucial time in the history of the world. This is an unspeakable tragedy to the family and to the nation.
Senator Yarborough, were you with President Kennedy talking with him this morning before this occurred?
Oh, before the cavalcade. Oh, yes, I've talked with him. He was optimistic and enthusiastic about things in Texas. The crowds were so great. The people had turned out with such great
greetings. There were so many more than were there when he came in 1960, and so much more enthusiastic. It was, someone said that, well, Mrs. Kennedy was enjoying it too. The people wanted to see her so, and the crowds were so vast and so cheerful and so glad to see her, to see him.
Did you see her, Mrs. Kennedy, afterwards at the hospital?
Yes, I saw Mrs. Kennedy after that. I think the whole nation, the whole world sorrows with her at the loss of her husband, the father of our children, and this great leader of this nation and the free world. This is the saddest day I've known in American history, my lifetime.
Thank you very much, Senator Yarborough. This is Nancy Dickerson of NBC News at Andrews Air Force Base.
Before now, we have briefly quoted the ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, the man who ran against President Kennedy in 1960, or tried to, for the nomination, who was later appointed to stewardship at a very sensitive level of our government. Now it's time, there's an opportunity to hear what Adlai Stevenson says in person about the death of President Kennedy.
The tragedy of this day is beyond instant comprehension. All of us who knew him will bear the grief of his death to the day of ours. And all men everywhere who love peace and justice and freedom will bow their heads. At such a moment, we can only turn to prayer. Prayer to comfort our grief, to sustain Mrs. Kennedy and his family, to strengthen President Johnson, and to guide us in time to come. May God help us.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have later advices from Texas on the manhunt for President Kennedy's killer or killers. Lee Oswald, the 24-year-old American, the renegade who went to Russia, the man who admires Fidel Castro, is still in custody. It's been several hours now. After 2 hours of questioning, the Dallas police report they're technically in charge, although they're not entirely in charge of this operation, that Lee Oswald has denied any connection with the shooting either of the policemen who was shot near a theater where Oswald was captured, or he has denied any connection with the shooting of the President of the United States. He's still under questioning, and the witnesses have not confronted him as yet. It is very important that so many people disagree. It happens in automobile accidents. Why shouldn't it happen in other events that are not exactly accidents? It is important that so many disagree as to how many shots were fired. We now are advised officially from the hospital, and no doubt the autopsy on the President's body tonight in Bethesda Naval Hospital near Washington will bear this out, that the President was shot twice. Now, it has been reported before that Governor John Connelly, with him in the car, was shot twice. And yet witnesses heard only 3 shots. We do know for sure that the President has been shot twice. It is possible that one of the shots of the 3 also struck the governor, or maybe 2. But in any event, he has been shot twice. And by the way, they have operated on Governor John Connelly. A lung has been reinflated that had collapsed as a result of the wounds. He has been shot in the back, one of the major shots. But it is still the report in Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas, that Governor John Connelly is, while he's in serious condition, is not in critical condition, and that he continues to show improvement at this time. Incidentally, the President's body was brought to Washington in a bronze casket. It was placed in a military ambulance to be taken to the Naval Hospital at Bethesda. It will remain there during the night for the autopsy, which, as we reported to you before, is routine in such official deaths as the President of the United States in circumstances that are beyond the natural. And a full and complete report will be in the history books of the nation concerning the manner of the death and the cause of the death, the accurate details of the President of the United States. That's why the body was taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital near Washington. It will go to the White House tomorrow morning, where it will lie in repose for the private mourning of the family and for those who were close to the Kennedy family, either in the official family of the cabinet and others or in the Congress. But this is a private act. The body in repose at the White House. Later it will be taken to the Capitol, where it will lie in the rotunda for the public, lying in state for the tribute of the nation at large. Foreign policy, of course, has been the urgent concern of the President. The speech he did not deliver in Dallas today, one of the speeches he was to have made there, dealt almost exclusively with the foreign policy of the United States and our place in the world today. One of the nations where we've been having difficulty in foreign policy has been Brazil, where insistent but minority left-wing elements have almost captured the government, where Brazil has taken exception to Kennedy policies regarding the Alliance for Progress. Brazil wanted direct relations with Washington in alliance money. They wanted control of alliance money, but their government has shown very little responsibility in handling such money for the simple reason there has been 67% inflation, at least in Brazil. But the Brazilian people today showed an attitude that their government has not revealed to us lately. And I think it fitting at this time that we go now to Wilson Hall in Rio de Janeiro.
Hundreds of Brazilians converged on the American embassy tonight to assure them of something they cannot or don't want to believe, that President Kennedy is dead. All radio and television stations were off the air today because of the strike, so the news of President Kennedy's death spread by word of mouth. The foreign minister presented Brazil's official condolence to American Ambassador Lincoln Gordon. Rio de Janeiro is to have an official 5-day period of mourning for late President Kennedy. President Kennedy was very popular personally down here. They liked President Kennedy because he was young, because of his faith, and because of his interest in Latin America. Brazilians, I would say, are shocked, saddened, and even angered at the news of President Kennedy's assassination. People stop me on the street and ask if I'm an American. When I say yes, they all say, what a great tragedy, and we all offer our condolences. One told me, how can you Americans allow such things to happen to your president? And one person called the office of Time magazine here and asked, what's the matter with you Americans? You murder 2 presidents who try to free the slaves. Wilson Hall, NBC News, Rio de Janeiro.
It's a fairly odd comment for a nation or among the people of a nation that have had many tragedies of this kind in history and know more about assassination of officers than most. Incidentally, NBC's Nancy Dickerson in Washington reports that Senator Hubert Humphrey has related a tragically ironic comment that President Kennedy recently made. And before we get to the comment, we should explain it. President Ramiro Betancourt of Venezuela has been under attack from both right and left. The right-wing Trujillo people from Santo Domingo tried to kill him when he entered into the presidency of Venezuela. And the communists, the Castro communists, have made no less than 15 attempts on the life of Betancourt. He was once severely injured in the last 4 years. And if he should end his term, this time it will be the first time that a president of Venezuela has served a 4-year term, complete. Before now, either a dictator's taken over or some tragedy has occurred. In relation to that, Mr. Kennedy recently remarked to Hubert Humphrey, the senator from Minnesota, that, you know, he said, I always worry about President Betancourt of Venezuela and the possibility that he may be assassinated, meaning that as a friend of the United States, this man is a stalwart in Latin America. Actually, 24 people have been killed in violence initiated by Castro communists in Caracas, Venezuela, within the last few days, and scores have been wounded. Hundreds have been arrested as Castro conspirators. Incidentally, the mourning of other nations is beginning to appear, shall we say, more intense than perhaps we first realized. It's not all limited to statements by high officials. As we've heard from Joseph Harsh in London, the feeling of the Prime Minister was very clearly showing through everything he said about the death of President Kennedy. For a surprising reaction, we take you now to Wlls-Hangen in Bonn, Germany.
How are you, Morgan?
How are you, Wells?
Pretty good.
What have you got to report this time?
Well, the West German Chancellor, Ludwig Erhard, has come back from his talks in Paris. He got off the train here in Bonn and was visibly shaken by the news which he'd received by radio telephone on the special train that brought him back. He went directly from the railway station to the radio studio here in Bonn, where he made a very emotional short tribute to the president and said that the German people would now stand at the side of the American people. Erhard has also indicated, not directly, but through his foreign minister, Gerhard Schröder, that he will be coming to the States for the funeral. As you know, Erhard had been scheduled to leave on Sunday night for talks with Mr. Kennedy on Monday and Tuesday in Washington. Of course, that is no longer possible, but he will be coming for the funeral, although he doesn't know when that will be or when he'll be leaving.
Well, that is a most touching development. I think Americans are, in recent months, have not been prepared for an emotional outpouring of a friendly nature from other people, and I am sure that perhaps, or do you think that the Chancellor has that in mind when he has decided to come here?
Yes, I think he does. I think he felt himself very close to the president, even though they didn't know each other intimately. They had met several times. Most recently, when Mr. Kennedy was here in Germany, he made his triumphal official visit at the end of June, and a speech that is now enshrined in history in Berlin, in which he said, "I am a Berliner," and that, of course, the memory of that visit is still very fresh with people here, and Berliners particularly have been shaken by the news tonight. Erhard called the president the embodiment of Western ideals in this radio talk that he gave. He said the German people would never forget his steadfastness in some of their most difficult hours. He was referring, of course, to the building of the Communist Wall in Berlin in August 1961, when the Germans felt that the division of their country was being perpetuated. And at that time, of course, Mr. Kennedy did order an extra battle group of American troops to go to West Berlin, and this is something for which he will always be remembered here. They looked upon this as a tangible evidence of American support at what was their darkest hour, perhaps, since the Berlin blockade.
Well, thank you, Wells, for whatever consolation there is. There seems to be an indication, a beginning of an indication, if we may sort of write our story of tomorrow on the air tonight, that the death of President Kennedy may bring the Western Alliance closer together, in fact.
Yes. Incidentally, in Munich tonight, Morgan, you might be interested to know that a performance of Wagner's Meistersinger, which was being performed to mark the opening of the restored National State Opera there, was interrupted midway through and canceled in a tribute to Mr. Kennedy. It was a very gala affair, and of course everybody left the restored classical opera house and went home, and Munich was, of course, particularly unhappy that Mr. Kennedy didn't come down there on his visit, so they felt this thing too.
And you know, that stresses the importance and the prescience of the first sentence in President Johnson's first statement to the American people. We carried it some time ago in his own voice from Plainside at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, but I think perhaps we could repeat it. It's such a brief statement. This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask your help and God's. It is interesting to feel that our allies are beginning to sense the importance of close communications with the United States at this time.
Yes, in that connection, Morgan, you know, Chancellor Earhart has already cabled President Johnson, and in that cable he said the federal government, meaning, of course, the West German government and the whole German nation, stand beside you and the American people. Johnson, of course, is well known and well remembered here because it was he who was the first important visitor to reach West Berlin after the communist wall went up in August 1961. Johnson appeared in Berlin and revived the spirits of the West Berliners even before any West German leaders had come to that city. So he's very warmly remembered, especially in Berlin, for that visit.
And we have considerable evidence, that President Johnson feels the cares of this office the minute he's undertaken it. He, in his own way, has expressed the same attitude that President Truman expressed when he said he felt like the stars and the moon and a ton of hay had fallen on him. President Johnson said nothing of that sort today, but once his helicopter had arrived at the White House with George Bundy, the president's very close personal advisor on security affairs, and with Defense Secretary Robert S. McNamara with him, the three of them left the rest of the party when President Johnson arrived at the White House. It seemed as if it were an act that had been performed without any thought, that the three of them walked together toward the door of the executive offices, and at the door, President Johnson sort of stopped, and he turned. His face was haggard, and he seemed to be alone. Mr. Bundy and Mr. McNamara seemed to sense the same thing. Johnson spoke very briefly to the two men as they walked through the rose garden, and then he turned and walked alone through the French doors into the White House. The man who bears the burden of the presidency of the United States, the central power in the alliance of the free world. I am sure he senses it very deeply, and that first sentence he wrote shows it. This is a sad time for all people. Any more to report from that end, Wells?
Well, Morgan, the West German Army is still on mobilization alert, what the Germans call alert condition number 1, which is the highest alert short of all-out war. This was taken as a precautionary measure, as you know, because the Germans were afraid that the Russians might try to capitalize on confusion or disarray following Mr. Kennedy's death and make some move against West Germany or West Berlin. So far, there is no sign of any unusual activity by the Russians or by the East German communists.
Well, Wells, is there any sign at all? I've noticed that other capitals do not have it as yet. Is there any sign at all that these governments or the peoples of other countries are aware that a suspect on the other side of the Iron Curtain, or let's see, a sympathizer with the other side of the Iron Curtain, an American by the name of Lee H. Oswald, who once defected to Russia, is in custody in this thing? Has there been any reaction to that at all?
Not a specific reaction, no, Morgan. I think that is known here by the people who are following the news as it comes in. But, of course, it's already about 20 minutes after 1 in the morning, so most Germans have sorrowfully gone to bed, and those who are following the news haven't reacted particularly to the arrest of Oswald. Although in this country, where they are constantly coping with agents, a tie-up of that sort, the use of agents for this purpose, would certainly be no surprise. In fact, there have been a number of political murders and politically inspired murders carried out by Russian espionage. Of course, we don't know whether that is involved in this or not, but the Germans have had a lot of experience with that, especially directed against anti-communist Eastern European refugees who come to this country a number of them in the last year or so have been killed in very macabre ways by Soviet agents. So it would come as no surprise to these people to know that there might have been some involvement of that sort in Mr. Kennedy's death.
And it seems logical to conclude that the silence of our federal officials in Dallas, the FBI, the Secret Service, and of course, in emergency, all other of the security branches of the government, even postal inspectors, any service, Treasury agents are all used in a situation of this kind, as we know, you and I as reporters. It's significant that not one of these agencies has said one word as yet. It's the Dallas police who say that this man is a sympathizer, a former defector to communism who went to Russia, and they say he's a prime suspect. As we've reported to the audience in the United States, the radio audience, the man has made no confession, or at least he had not, after 2 hours of questioning, so that perhaps your officials over there are being just as careful as our federal officials here. They do not like to shoot from the hip with a lot of wild statements about these matters because nobody really knows as yet just exactly what has taken place. There's a tremendous manhunt on in that part of Texas, as you know. The Mexican government has closed its entire border to travel. This is a natural precaution. So close to the border there, it would be assumed that any assassin or group of assassins would try for a jump across that border as the best and safest haven in a case of this kind. They've closed that border, showing their own suspicions in the matter. And our fellow authorities have put out a dragnet practically all over the place. They are not telling us exactly what they've done. But there's no doubt about it, this thing was well planned. The execution of the killing was almost diabolically, if I may repeat a word I've used before, certain in its execution.
Yes, the American authorities here, of course, were on the phone to Washington immediately after they had the news. General Paul Freeman, who is the commander of the American 7th Army with headquarters in Heidelberg, was on his own telephone to the Pentagon as soon as he had the news, asking what, if anything, they should do. We still have no official word, but the American troops here, some 250,000 of them, are reported to be on alert, although the alert status is not as high as the West German troops have been ordered onto. That is, the West German troops are on alert number 1, which is the highest short of actual fighting, as I mentioned before.
Yes, we may be sure that all security officers of the Allied powers, even though it is not necessary, so far as surface indications would indicate, are in intimate contact with each other at this time, as they always are. Now, Wells, it might be interesting to you and your further coverage over there. We're doing this for our radio audience, of course, but you might be interested to stay with us, and maybe you have something further to say, because we have now a report on more details about what's going on in the White House with the new president in charge. So let's bring in Richard Valeriani at the White House.
President Lyndon Baines Johnson was sworn in as the 36th president in a small, crowded compartment of the presidential jet, Air Force One, while it was on the ground in Dallas. The time was 2:38 p.m. The president repeated the oath of office solemnly with his right hand upraised and his left hand on a small leather Bible provided to him by Lawrence O'Brien, President Kennedy's liaison officer in Congress. The oath was administered by a tiny 67-year-old woman, U.S. District Judge Sarah Kiles, one of the few women on the federal bench. The new president added to the oath of office afterwards, "So help me God." The voice of Judge Kiles could scarcely be heard above the whine of the jet. The new president held up the swearing-in ceremony for the arrival of Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of the slain president. Immediately after the swearing-in ceremony, Mrs. Johnson, who was at her husband's side, stepped forward and clasped the hand of Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy. Dallas Police Chief J.E. Curry, who had driven President Johnson to the airport in Dallas, then told Mrs. Kennedy, "God bless you, little lady. You ought to go back and lie down." The president's widow managed a faint smile and said, "No, thank you. I'm fine." Then shortly thereafter, she left and went back to a compartment in the rear of the plane where the bronze coffin containing the remains of her husband was. She remained with that coffin on the flight back. During the return trip, President Johnson called Mrs. Rose Kennedy, the mother of the president, and Mrs. Nellie Connelly, the wife of the Texas governor who was also hit in the assassination. This is Richard Valeriani, NBC News at the White House in Washington.
Thank you for excellent recapitulation. On that Mexican border closing, we have further reports. The United States has not closed the border. It's Mexico, and we now have reports from informed sources in the federal district. That's you might say, the government headquarters in Mexico City. It is believed that the assassin still not caught may be headed for Mexico. Therefore, you can see that at least there's some doubt as to whether or not Oswald is the man, or if he is, that he did not have associates in this terrible deed that was performed in Dallas today. Incidentally, the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City reports that the United States government has issued no order, so far as it knows, to close the frontiers. But tourists in Mexico had a disturbed reaction to the closing of the border by the Mexican government, because the Mexican government has made it very plain that this closing is not a matter that will be at all amended. There are going to be no exceptions, and they've also indicated they don't know and will not say at this time when the border will be reopened. Some Mexican authorities do point out that it will depend on how soon the terrible tragedy concerning the president has been solved.
The NBC radio network will stay on the air with continuous coverage until 1 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will resume broadcasting at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time Saturday tomorrow with continuous coverage. We pause now for 10 seconds for station identification.
This is WLW Cincinnati. WLW Radio is suspending our regularly scheduled programs during this time of mourning for our late President John F. Kennedy. We ask you to join with us in prayer for John Kennedy, his family, and President Lyndon Johnson.
We've had several references to the interest of the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, the parallel interests he had with the late President Kennedy. I am constrained at this time to read to you a speech that President Kennedy, to read it again, this is the second time, gave or was to have given in Dallas at a time that would have been just after his death. And there are indications that President Johnson shares the thoughts in this short speech that President Kennedy was to have made, beginning, my friends and fellow citizens. I cite facts and figures to make it clear that America today is stronger than ever before. Our adversaries have not abandoned their ambitions. Our dangers have not diminished. Our vigilance cannot be relaxed. But now we have the military, the scientific, and the economic strength to do whatever must be done for the preservation and promotion of freedom. That strength will never be used in pursuit of aggressive ambitions. It will always be used in pursuit of peace. It will never be used to promote provocations. It will always be used to promote the peaceful settlement of disputes. We in this country, in this generation, the President was to have said, are by destiny rather than choice the watchmen on the walls of world freedom. We ask, therefore, that we may be worthy of our power and responsibility, that we may exercise our strength with wisdom and restraint, and that we may achieve in our time and for all time the ancient vision of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. That must always be our goal, and the righteousness of our cause must always underlie our strength. For as was written long ago, except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. I would hazard a guess, knowing President Johnson, I've known him for several years, that he is going to make reference to the speech that was to have been, that was never delivered by the President of the United States. We have now further details on the death of the President from the point of view of the men who drove the car, the man at the wheel of the presidential automobile, Secret Service man Bill Greet. He's the man who took the President to the hospital where he died. He said that he already knew where to go in an emergency, and therefore He went there as fast as he possibly could. The signals were already set for him, and there was no delay. As you've heard from Senator Ralph Yarborough of Texas, who spoke to our Nancy Dickerson in Washington, the speed of that drive was phenomenal, but careful. The scene in Washington tonight is stark tragedy. Perhaps you would like to hear about the transfer of the body of the late president. A gray Navy ambulance drove through the dark November streets. They bore the body of the slain president back through Washington for the last time tonight. The route traveled from Andrews Air Force Base in nearby Maryland to Bethesda Naval Hospital. Was the usual route through busy traffic. After arrival at Andrews Field, the bronze-colored casket of the assassinated chief executive was placed on a lift truck at a plane door by 4 of Kennedy's aides. Flashes of bronze light glittered with painful intensity from floodlights at the mournful scene. In final salute, an Air Force honor guard snapped to rigid attention, and 6 sailors moved in to carry the coffin to an ambulance. That stark gray Navy ambulance that was to drive through the streets, the dark November streets. There was a hush as the casket was brought to the lift truck by Lawrence F. O'Brien, the Special Assistant for Legislative Affairs, and Kenneth O'Donnell, Kennedy's appointments secretary, and Dave Powers, the White House receptionist and longtime presidential crony. Dave Powers, the man that on every other occasion has always had a joke on his lips, had no such joke tonight. And Brigadier General Godfrey McHugh, the president's Air Force aide, completed the party that lifted the casket down. Mrs. Kennedy, strained with grief, but still standing up and protesting to anyone who asked that she was all right. Mrs. Kennedy was escorted by Attorney General Robert Kennedy and her husband's naval aide, Captain Tazewell Shepard. Joining the mourners in the ambulance was Mrs. Evelyn Lincoln, Kennedy's secretary over the years. She was at his side at the side of President Johnson when he took the oath today. The president's body arrived at the Bethesda Hospital shortly after 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. Before driving to the rear of the hospital, the hearse paused at the front entrance of the building. Several hundred people were gathered there. The crowd stood back in silence. Details of Marine Corps security troops were posted at the main entrance of the hospital. Hospital authorities report that as yet they have no orders, but they understand orders will be given for a postmortem and autopsy, as is usual in the case of a death of this kind of a president of the United States. Many Americans are aware that the mayor of New York City has for years been very close to President John F. Kennedy. Oh, they've had their differences, but nevertheless, Mayor Robert Wagner is very close, or was, to the president who has just died. That places a special significance on a statement he has issued in New York. Here is the statement of Mayor Robert Wagner of New York City.
President Kennedy has joined the company of the martyrs. The enormity of the loss the world has today suffered is incalculable. We pray for the repose of his soul and for the comfort of his widow and children and loved ones. The world mourns, the nation mourns, the city mourns. My grief and that of all New Yorkers, I know, is personal and irreparable. He was my friend. He was also a friend of man, a friend of peace, a champion and sword of justice. We, each and all, have suffered a loss, many losses, for which we cannot be consoled. Hate has reaped its harvest. Now we must not leave undone any of the great works he was doing, and doing so valorously, so eagerly, so brilliantly. A light has gone out in the world. The nation will carry on under President Johnson.
New York City as a whole, and I as mayor, and as an individual, pledge him and our government, and I know our country, total and undivided support in these sad and most difficult and most challenging hours.
All of us have noticed, no doubt, that nearly every person who has made a statement, persons in official capacity, religious leaders, government leaders, nearly every person who's made a statement about the death of President Kennedy has made the kind of a statement that you don't usually hear from these people. Because often people in high office have to have their statements written for them. I caught a note in Mayor Bob Wagner's statement tonight that he didn't leave this to any assistants or any associates or any public relations advisors as to what he wanted to say about the death of his friend. It was not particularly eloquent in the sense of eloquent statements, as a British politician would practice eloquence at a time like this, but it was certainly heartfelt and apropos. Perhaps it would be good at this time to go over the plans ahead for the President's body. At 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, the family will see the President in repose. At 11 a.m., President Johnson, Speaker McCormick, former U.S. presidents, and members of the executive branch of the government who are presidential appointees will go into the East Room of the White House to view the body and to pay proper tribute. And at 2 p.m., the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary, all members of it in Washington or others who happen to be there, that time at 2:30 is set aside for them to go to the East Room. And at 2:30 p.m., the members of the Senate and the House of Governors of the House and of the governors of the 50 states and territories, those of them who can be in Washington, may pay their respects. These are private respects. The body's in repose. And at 5 p.m., the first semi-public exposure of the President's body will occur when the diplomatic corps goes in. As you know, the body is now in Bethesda Naval Hospital for autopsy, and it will be removed tomorrow morning to the White House and later will be in the rotunda of the Capitol for national and public mourning. And we have more details on those arrangements at this time. We take you now to NBC's Robert Goralski at the White House in Washington.
8 members of the Congress, Democrats and Republicans, have just arrived at the White House for a conference with President Lyndon Johnson. They include the Speaker of the House of Representatives, John McCormick, and the House Minority Leader, Charles Halleck, and the Republican and Democratic leaders of the Senate, Senator Mike Mansfield and Everett Dirksen. The other senators and congressmen are Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, George Smathers of Florida, William Fulbright of Arkansas, and Thomas Kuchel of California. The President has just concluded a meeting, or is about to conclude a meeting that began about an hour and 10 minutes ago, with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and McGeorge Bundy, who was President Kennedy's chief advisor on national security matters. And presumably that meeting dealt with national and international affairs. The vice presidents sometimes are not as thoroughly briefed as they should be, and undoubtedly in a time of national crisis such as this, the new president of the United States had to be briefed by the Secretary of Defense and the White House's chief authority on security matters. Bring him up to date, because this is a time of crisis, and in such moments perhaps unfriendly nations could engage in provocative actions. And now with President Johnson as Commander-in-Chief of the military forces, he had to keep fully abreast of developments as of this moment. So far as we know, Mrs. Kennedy is still at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the body of President Kennedy was brought directly from Andrews Air Force Base a short time ago. Mrs. Kennedy, it's believed, will probably return to the White House sometime later this evening. So far as we know, the 2 children of President and Mrs. Kennedy have not been told about Mr. Kennedy's death. Caroline and John Jr. are still in the executive mansion, and it's believed that Mrs. Kennedy will return here sometime this evening and inform them of this deep tragedy. So far as funeral arrangements are concerned, as Morgan Beatty mentioned a few moments ago, the President will lie in repose tomorrow in the East Room of the White House, On Saturday, he will lie in state in the rotunda of the Capitol building, and it's believed that the president will be buried in Brookline, Massachusetts, in the family plot, which only 4 months ago received the body of 3-day-old Patrick Bouvier Kennedy. This is Robert Goralski, NBC News, reporting from the White House.
And now I think it appropriate for us to go back over recent events in the life of the late President John Kennedy. Particularly touching is a scene that occurred in New York City last Friday, November the 15th. If you will recall, the President came to New York primarily to address a convention of the AFL-CIO, the combined labor unions, the most powerful labor unions in the country. He made that speech, and afterward he agreed to go across the street from the hotel he was in to the Hilton, the New York Hilton, where were gathered a conference of Catholic youth in the United States. Now, this was to be not so much a formal dress occasion. It was sort of off the cuff, the President's constant desire to get in touch, particularly with youth. He's often shaken hands, people along the route in parades and so on. And so it had to be a sort of warm occasion. And so on November the 15th, last Friday, he crossed the street from his formal duties to perform some duties he dearly loved to perform. And he arrived before the audience, and there, to describe the scene and introduce the President of the United States, NBC's Joseph Michaels.
All of these youngsters are on their feet, laughing just as hard as they can. Mr. Kennedy just came to the microphones on the balcony from which he will speak to the people down below. And these youngsters are just yelling and clapping as though their lives depended on it. I don't think the President has been so happy in some time either. He's standing back, nodding his head. Now they're calling for silence.
Young man. Young man, young woman of the CYO, the President of the United States. Senior, father, sisters, fellow members of the CYO. How many actually do come from Boston and Massachusetts? And then how many from the rest of the country? I'm glad to be here today. I said to the Monsignor coming up that I was pleased to see the sisters, that in my experience, Monsignors and bishops are all Republicans, while sisters are all Democrats. In any case, I'm glad to see you, and I want to congratulate you on the effort that you're making. The theme of this meeting is youth and service, and I can't imagine a greater cause in which to be engaged, to give the best that you have, than for the United States. Because upon the United States rest not only the burdens of caring for 190 million people, but also for hundreds of millions of people around the globe who today, without hope, look to the United States. Whatever we're able to do in this country, whatever success we're able to make of ourselves, whatever leadership we're able to give, whatever demonstration we can make that a free society can function and move ahead and provide a better life for its people, all those things that we do here have their effect all around the globe. The world is engaged in the most difficult and trying struggle in its long history. all of the great epics which have torn the world for the last 2,000 years pale in comparison to the great ideological gulf which separates us from those who oppose us. It is our responsibility not merely to denounce our enemies and those who make themselves our enemies, but to make this system work, to demonstrate what freedom can do, what those who are committed to freedom and the future can do. So I realize that this meeting is not only a meeting of the youth today, but those of whom we expect so much in the future. Winston Churchill once said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other systems that have been tried. It is the most difficult. It requires more of you. Discipline, character, self-restraint, a willingness to serve the public interest as well as our own private interest. All of these priests and sisters who have gathered you together from all over the United States don't do it merely because, even though they want you to do well, they don't do it merely because they want 4,000 or 5,000 boys and girls to do well. It's because they regard you as the future leaders of the United States, as the future leaders of a great free country. That's why I come here today. Not just because you are doing well and because you're outstanding students, but because we expect something of you. And unless in this free country of ours we're able to demonstrate that we're able to make this society work and progress, unless we can hope that from you we're going to get back all of the talents which society has helped develop in you, and quite obviously all the hopes of all of us that freedom will not only endure but prevail, of course we'll be disappointed. So we ask the best of you. I hope you'll spend your time now well, but I hope that in a long life that you will recognize your obligations to the great republic and to help those who need help, to help those millions of boys and girls who drop out of school, who can't find work, who live in underprivileged areas. I've been impressed by the fact that we've been able to get 10,000 young men and women to go around the world as part of the Peace Corps. But look at all the sections of the United States, in our large cities, in eastern Kentucky, parts of southern Illinois, parts of Ohio, West Virginia, where people live lives of desperation, without hope, and they look to this country, they look to you, and they look to me to serve. So I hope that all of you will serve. Serve not only your families, your church, but also serve this country. It deserves the best. It's been very generous to us all, and we must be generous in return. So I congratulate you on what you've done, and most of all, I congratulate you on what you're going to do. Thank you.
This is Bill Fitzgerald in the NBC newsroom in New York. You've just heard an address by President Kennedy last week to a group of CYO young people in New York City. Naturally, the tragic story of his death is reverberating around the world. Moscow Radio tonight played funeral music after announcing the death of President Kennedy, and of course Western diplomats were aghast. American ambassador in Moscow, Foy D. Kohler, said when told of the news, "It's terrible, it's terrible." The radio, the Moscow Radio, quoted reports that extreme right-wing elements were believed responsible for the assassination. News of the president's death by a bullet in the head was immediately passed to top Soviet figures. Russian sources were told, of course, that he had died in Texas. No reaction from the Kremlin is expected until tomorrow. As we have said, the leaders of the free world and the communist world have reacted, and at the moment now we will hear a statement from the Prime Minister of Canada, Lester Pearson.
The Parliament of Canada was hushed this afternoon. The voice of party controversy was silenced as I performed, as Prime Minister, the hard duty of announcing the sad news of the death of the President of the United States. A death so sudden and so shocking that it left us, as I'm sure it left you, stunned and unbelieving. The world can ill afford his loss. Canadians, next to Americans themselves, will feel most deeply the tragedy of that loss. That loss, through assassination, is one of the great tragedies of history. But for us, now, it is something more. It is a great, heartbreaking, personal tragedy. And there are millions of people tonight who, throughout the world, will feel that they have lost a friend. President Kennedy was young. He was a man of courage in war and in peace. He devoted himself to public service. He worked unselfishly for the public good as he saw it. He has paid for this public service with his life. There is a mystery in a tragedy of this kind that we cannot easily or fully understand. But as we lament the tragedy, we are grateful for the President's life and for his work, for the service that he gave, and for the way he prepared himself for that service, and for the courage he has shown in discharging it. May he rest in the peace that he has earned.
In a little more than an hour from now, there will be a meeting in Washington with President Johnson. And those who have arrived for that meeting include Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield, the Senate Majority Whip Hubert Humphrey, Senator William Fulbright, Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen, Senator George Smathers of Florida, the House Speaker John McCormick, and the House Minority Leader Charles Halleck. The group is meeting across the street from the White House in the old State Department building, now known as the Executive Office, where President Johnson, as Vice President, maintained an office. Needless to say, the news of President Kennedy's assassination struck Washington like a bombshell early this afternoon or early this evening. Virtually every agency of the federal government came to a temporary standstill as officials and employees, high and low, reacted in what people have said was shocked disbelief, and this apparently has been the general attitude of people the world over. They just couldn't believe it. Word flashed out to an airplane over the Pacific recalling 6 members of the president's cabinet who were en route from Honolulu to a trade conference in Tokyo. Acting Secretary of State George Ball, whose chief was among those aboard the plane, Secretary Rusk, summoned an emergency meeting at top State Department officials to determine what steps are needed to be taken before Secretary Rusk arrived back in Washington. And, of course, he's on his way. For one thing, the State Department sent out official notification of the president's death to the heads of all diplomatic missions in Washington and all U.S. ambassadors abroad. The Secret Service set up a guard in the office of Speaker of the House John W. McCormick, who was next in line of presidential succession after the new president, Lyndon Johnson. The 71-year-old McCormick, who, like Kennedy, is a Massachusetts Democrat and Roman Catholic, was at lunch in the House restaurant when newsmen told him that the president had been shot. We will pause now for a station identification so that our stations can identify themselves.
WLW Radio in Cincinnati joins its listeners in an expression of deep sorrow on the death of our president.